Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I still remember that night well. So dark and cold that it is still vivid in my dreams even today. It was in the late winter days of 1945, when the war had already reached its bitter climax, and the shadows of the Nazi regime lay like a dark veil over the Rhineland. At that time, I, Private Karl Richter, was part of a unit that had settled in Bedburg, a small, almost forgotten village near Cologne. Our task was to secure the area as the front lines inched ever closer. The villagers, elderly women, exhausted men and frightened children, looked at us as if we were the last hope in the midst of a raging nightmare. The hatred that could be seen in the eyes of the soldiers and at the same time in the trembling looks of the civilians was almost tangible. The night began like any other in that bleak time. We had entrenched ourselves in an old, abandoned farmhouse on the edge of the village. The building smelled of damp stone and old wood, and the creaking floorboards under our boots reminded us of every step we had taken as we set out into the darkness. I remember how Sergeant Major Friedrich Bard, a weather-beaten veteran with stern eyes and a deep, rough voice, ordered us, "Hold the position, comrades, hold the position, and be prepared for anything." His words echoed in the narrow corridors as we prepared for the upcoming patrol. In the middle of this eerie silence, an urgent call reached us over the crackling radio. "Station Bedburg, this is radio station 1. Come in, over." The voice on the other end sounded nervous, almost trembling, as if it had not yet overcome the horror of the past few days itself. I felt the blood freeze in my veins as I realized something was wrong. The radio crackled, and then a single monotonous voice came through. Noises coming from the manor house, something not of this world. The words faded into the darkness as we stole glances at each other. We had been called out that evening to investigate an old mansion located on a lonely road off the main highway, a building that looked like it had been transported from another century. The facade was crisscrossed with countless cracks, and in the weak moonlight, the dilapidated towers appeared like ghostly witnesses to a bygone era. As we approached the property, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Every fiber of my body screamed out a warning, but the order was unmistakable. We had to go in and find out what was going on there. The entrance to the house was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, and as we pushed open the heavy wooden door, we were hit by the smell of mold and old blood. Inside, it was as if time had stood still. The furniture was covered with white cloths, as if it were silent testimony to a celebration that had long since ended. But something was wrong. Everywhere there were strange propaganda posters showing the image of a radiant, superhuman leader, framed by symbolic runes and wolf angel motifs that reminded us of the cruel rituals of the Nazis. As we moved cautiously through the rooms, I spotted an old closet in a darkened hallway that seemed almost untouched. On its edge, I found an engraving carved in Old German script, Mutatio Vitae. These words, change of life, made my heart beat faster, because I instinctively knew that they belonged to the occult experiments that the rumors among the officers kept coming up about. Suddenly, the radio came back on. "Station Bedburg, this is radio station 1. Confirm, have you noticed anything unusual? Respond, answer." The crackling voice demanded a quick response, and while I answered in a shaky voice, I felt the darkness around me become denser. We combed the property systematically, searching every room and every niche. as if the horror that had been haunting us for so long was hiding there. In one of the rooms, we discovered a large wooden altar between the dusty curtains, on which burning candles and strange symbols of red paint were arranged in a circular pattern. I could hardly believe what I saw. It was as if the Nazis had performed a ritual here that was beyond human imagination. The atmosphere in the house was unbearably heavy, and every step we took seemed to be watched by an invisible force. I remember one moment when Sergeant Bard ordered me to descend into a long, dark corridor. "Comrades, be on your guard. Something we don't understand could be lurking here," he said with a serious expression. The sounds of our footsteps on the cold stone floor and the distant dripping of water were the only things that broke the oppressive silence. I held my M16 tight as we descended slowly deeper into the basement. There, in the damp darkness, we discovered a room larger than any we had seen before. The room was filled with old furniture, broken tiles, and piles of rotting straw. On the walls hung faded photographs, family portraits, all of them bearing baleful smiles and eyes that seemed to see death itself. I couldn't help but think of the propaganda we were taught in the field. The Germans were not human, but mere puppets of a murderous ideal. And yet, when I looked into the eyes of one of the soldiers depicted, I felt a strange pang of compassion, as if they too had become victims of a cruel game. Suddenly, a dull crashing sound broke the silence, and one of my comrades, Lieutenant Dieter Müller, shouted over the radio. "Station Bedburg, this is Müller. We heard something big, repeat, something big." His voice was filled with panic, and I could hear something eerily metallic clanking in the background. We all knew that on nights like this, any shadow could come to life. With pounding hearts and shaking hands, we crept towards the sound. In another room, we found a massive iron-clad box that had apparently been locked for years. The air smelled particularly pungent here, as if the room held the essence of a forgotten ritual. The surface of the box was engraved with old, rusty symbols, a jumble of signs reminiscent of both the occult heritage and the military discipline of the Nazis. We used our radios to call for backup, and the response came almost immediately. "Station Bedburg to all units. Report in, confirm your position. This appears to be a high-priority object, over. Repeat, high-priority object." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of fear-filled investigations, nervous radio conversations, and the constant feeling of being stalked by an invisible presence. I remember thinking again and again about the altar on the upper floor, the eerie flickering of the candles, and the words mutatio vitae echoing in my mind. It seemed as if fate was manifesting itself in this abandoned mansion, a fate that bore witness to the dark experiments and fanatical ideology of the Nazis. In the early morning hours, as the fog rolled in over the Rhine and the first delicate rays of the morning sun penetrated through the windows, we were surprised by a new radio message. "Station Bedburg, this is Radio Station 2. Please confirm. Do you have any living remains or signs of occult activity on site? Reply urgently, over." I felt my heart contract as I replied. "This is Bedburg. We found evidence of more than just ancient rites. There are things that cannot be explained." The ensuing radio silence was deafening. It was as if someone, or something, was lurking in the darkness, swallowing our words. The next few hours dragged on as we meticulously noted every detail, photographed every unusual object, and kept records as if we were on the trail of a heinous crime. The real police reports, which we later sent to headquarters in Cologne, spoke of strange noises, unidentifiable shadows, and an omnipresent coldness that did not even disappear in the warmer rooms of the mansion. We had clear instructions from our superiors to record all protocols exactly. including radio conversations in which the voices of our comrades could hardly contain their fear. As the day finally drew to a close, and we slowly made our way back, our thoughts were heavy with what we had experienced. I couldn't forget the shadowy outlines of the rooms and the ghostly lights dancing in the dark corners of the mansion. I thought of the words that Lieutenant Mueller had repeated several times, and of the eerie silence that enveloped us all like a spell. On the way back to the provisional base, I heard the voice over the radio again. "Station Bedburg, this is Radio Station 1. Confirm, are all units safe?" Reply, immediately, "Over." But my voice failed me as I whispered, "We are. We are not alone." The memory of that first part of that night, of the eerie signs and the constant fear of the unknown, still haunts me today. The thought that we had encountered not only ancient, forbidden rituals in that mansion, but something that went beyond the bounds of the imaginable, something that might still be lurking in the shadows, haunted me. It was as if darkness itself had become a living being, nesting in the hidden corners of this world, waiting to strike again. The silence after this operation was almost unbearable, and as I sat alone at my radio that night, listening to the monotonous repetition of the messages, I wondered, what if this dark presence is more than just a relic of the Nazi era? What if it is still watching us, haunting us in the darkest hours of our lives? These questions haunted me as I left the base and stepped out into the gray morning. The sky over Bedburg gray and heavy with an invisible burden. When the darkness of night finally gave way, and morning dawned in cold, dull rays of light over the destroyed streets of the Rhineland, everyday life returned in a way that no one would have thought possible. But in the shadows of the occupied cities of Cologne and Dusseldorf, the horror lived on, hidden in the files of the Secret Service employees, recorded in the police logs, and preserved in the furtive memories of those who had witnessed the terrible events. I, Corporal Karl Richter, was transferred to a provisional headquarters after that operation in Bedburg, where we received actual police reports, radio messages, and orders that sounded so sober and matter-of-fact that they hardly matched the unreality of that night. I remember one report that was received by the Office for Internal Security in Cologne. On February 27, 1945, at 4:15 a.m., Unit Bedburg reported unusual occurrences in an old mansion. Eyewitnesses report unexplainable phenomena, occult symbols and sounds that do not come from this world. An investigation is strongly advised. These sober words contrasted sharply with what I had experienced, a nightmare that dissolved the boundaries between madness and reality. Our unit was then accompanied by a special forces team that specialized in investigating mysterious incidents. Under the command of Captain Wilhelm Neumann, a man with a sharp mind and steely gaze, we were instructed to collect all evidence and witness statements. The orders were clear and precise. Gather all data, document every radio message and every detail. There is no speculation, only facts. We were also helped by the modern U.S. Army radios whose signals transmitted information in clear, factual language. So I kept hearing the command, "Radio Bedburg to all units. Check the facility and secure evidence. Repeat, secure the facility. Over." The investigations dragged on for days. In a cold office at the police headquarters in Düsseldorf, I sat with other witnesses and scarred soldiers while a meticulous clerk noted every move and every word. The documents spoke of a mansion in which not only traces of Nazi rituals were found, but also eerie phenomena that silenced even the most hardened soldiers. I remember how Master Sergeant Bard reported in a hoarse voice, "We found a sign there, Mutatio Vitae, carved in blood. It seemed as if someone had tried to conjure up something unimaginably great." In the same breath, I recall another report. Radio Station 1, reports that during the investigation in the basement of the manor house, inexplicable noises suddenly occurred that resembled human groans, but in an unnatural mechanical rhythm. Several men reported a feeling of oppression, as if they were being watched by invisible eyes. The investigators, including German detectives such as Inspector Franz Keller, conducted meticulous interviews. Keller, an old hand at these times, had a keen sense for the unusual. "I know what you're thinking," he once said to me quietly when we were discussing the dark corners of the manor house, "but believe me, more was done here than just waging war. It was as if the devil himself had had a hand in it." The investigation also took us to abandoned archives and piles of files containing reports of secret Nazi experiments and occult rituals from the period. One particularly disturbing report was from the Security Service headquarters in Berlin, which mentioned a project called Nachtwolf, an attempt to create a weapon that could spread not only physical, but also metaphysical terror. It was said that scientists and occult practitioners were conducting experiments in strict secrecy in old abandoned castles in the Black Forest. These reports seemed to correspond to the symbols and signs we had found in Bedburg. During the investigations, radio messages repeatedly emphasized the seriousness of the situation. I remember one of them, which still rings in my ears today. "Neumann Station, this is Radio Station 1. Please confirm. Have you found any traces of occult rituals or evidence of a supernatural phenomenon?" Answer urgently. Over. The answers came in short, matter-of-fact sentences that hardly expressed the fear we all felt inside. But behind these sober words lay an unspoken dread, a sense that what we were discovering went far beyond ordinary warfare. For days, we repeatedly secured the mansion and collected evidence, performing almost ritualistic maneuvers as if to exercise the eerie power that seemed to shine there. The combination of real police reports, detailed reports from the soldiers, and the meticulously secured radio recordings revealed a picture that was so grotesque and unreal that even the most hardened officers became uneasy. I remember one particularly eerie moment. While we were sitting in a cordoned-off room, the voice of a comrade came over the radio again, barely able to control himself. "Neumann radio station, this is Mueller. I swear I saw something that looked like a shadow, moving as if it were alive. I couldn't believe what I saw." Those words sent a cold shiver down our spines. The investigation in Dusseldorf, Cologne, and Bedburg took an increasingly sinister turn when evidence emerged of a network of mysteriously connected places, from old castles in the Black Forest to abandoned military camps on the Moselle. It seemed as if the Nazis, in their final days, not only waged war but also made a dark pact with something unimaginable. Captain Neumann ordered that all reports be compiled and a comprehensive analysis prepared. The results were to be summarized in a secret dossier that could only be made accessible to the highest-ranking officers. Despite all the care and scientific methodology, one question always remained. What had we really found? Every file, every radio message, and every testimony spoke of a horror that would not end, of a ritual that could not simply fade into the files of the war. There were days when I couldn't sleep at night, tormented by images of the manor house, of the ritual circles, of the eerie eyes that seemed to be watching me in the shadows. It was as if the curse of that night haunted us all, as if the darkness itself had entered our souls. In a last, desperate attempt to gain clarity, Inspector Keller and I conducted a disturbing interview with the survivor, a man named Hans Lehmann, who worked as a technician in a nearby factory in Cologne. Lehmann reported in fragmentary sentences that he had seen an unnatural glow in the sky that night, and that he had heard voices in an abandoned warehouse speaking in a strange, ancient dialect. His words were simple, but they were imbued with such honesty that they caused me a deep, inexplicable fear. "I don't know what it was," he said softly, but it felt like it awakened the souls of the dead, and they cried out for revenge. The meticulous collection of all this data, radio messages, witness statements, and secret documents led to a final report to be reviewed by the highest military authorities. But as I worked on this report, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling, as if in our research we had stumbled upon something that was better left undiscovered. It was as if darkness itself was warning us that some truths are too painful to reveal. That day, as I sat alone in the makeshift office, transcribing the report, I heard a faint, unintelligible whisper again, almost like a voice coming from the depths of the past. It was a quiet murmur, hardly more than a breath, and yet it felt so real, as if someone were standing right next to me and trying to tell me something. I looked up, but there was nothing but the shadowy outlines of the empty room. Yet at that moment I wondered, was all this just a product of war? Or had we discovered something that lay beyond human imagination? The investigation continued, and as we meticulously secured the papers, photos, and radio recordings, this question remained like a dark shadow over us. A shadow that did not disappear even in the brightest hours of the day. The following weeks blurred into a nightmare of inexplicable events that changed us all. Once the official investigation in Bedburg was complete, we, the survivors of that fateful night, were divided into different task forces to continue working on the secret documents and evidence. But the images of that night haunted me in my dreams. The abandoned mansion, the eerie symbols, and the constant feeling that something evil was still lurking in the shadows. I often found myself on a lonely night, standing on a small bridge over the Rhine, looking at the cold water and wondering if the darkness beneath the surface held all the horrors we had experienced back then. The police reports, later filed in the archives of the Criminal Investigation Department in Dusseldorf, stated, "There is a suspicion that occult phenomena and Nazi experiments are linked. Further investigation is imperative." But the deeper we dug, the more it seemed as if we were only scratching the surface of a far greater, sinister secret. I remember a particular radio call that came to me one rainy night in Cologne. Radio Neumann, this is Radio 3, confirmed that there are indications of similar rituals in several abandoned facilities in the Black Forest. "Urgent response, over." The voice was firm, but in its pauses one could hear the eerie hint of fear that permeated the otherwise precise radio communication. It seemed as if not only Bedburg, but also other places were affected by these ominous activities. Under the direction of Captain Neumann, several teams were sent to the Black Forest. I myself was part of one of these teams, which was stationed in an old castle near Freiburg. The castle, shrouded in dense fog, was a place that looked gloomy and foreboding even in daylight. In the castle's deep, damp corridors we found further signs, cryptic formulas written in faded ink that reminded us of the occult experiments we had documented in Bedburg. One radio message from that night that I will never forget went like this: "Radio Station Berg, this is Neumann. What we have found cannot be put into words. It is as if darkness itself lives within these walls. Repeat, we have found something that lies beyond imagination." In Freiburg itself, in an unassuming office of the Criminal Investigation Department, all these reports were brought together. Inspector Keller and I sat for days at a long wooden table, surrounded by old files, photos, and radio recordings. Keller, a man of grim determination, spoke softly. "Carl, what we see here is more than just the pain of war or the delusion of propaganda. It is as if the war has planted a dark seed in our souls that is now sprouting in these abandoned places." His words were like a silent reproach to us all, as if we had involuntarily become part of a much larger plan. we also discovered handwritten notes from former Nazi scientists who conducted secret experiments to change life itself. A dark alliance of technology and the occult. These reports were so detailed that they literally documented how to force the regeneration of tissue using blood rituals and occult symbols. In a particularly disturbing report written by a certain doctor, Heinrich Vogel, it was stated, "The mutation of life, mutatio vitae, is the key to a new order, an order that will herald the end of humanity." Words like that made my blood run cold, because they were not only an expression of a fanatical belief, but also a disturbing indication of experiments that were supposed to distort natural life. During these investigations, eerie radio conversations between the units occurred time and again. Once, I heard an order over the old radio that still robs me of my sleep today. "Freiburg radio station, this is Neumann. Secure all areas. We have reports of movement in the abandoned cellars of the castle. Be on guard, it could be a reaction. Repeat, secure all areas, over." These orders were delivered with a cool precision, but each of us knew that more was lurking behind these words than just enemy soldiers. It was as if an invisible force was trying to break free. In the days that followed, investigators and military personnel gathered in an old, makeshift briefing room in a converted water tower in Cologne. The walls were covered with maps, photos, and radio recordings. It was a place where you could feel the cold breath of despair as you tried to piece together all the pieces of a picture that seemed to be becoming increasingly incomplete. Between the serious looks and subdued voices, the sentence, "This can't be true," kept coming up, an expression that made the unreality of the situation all too clear. I remember one particularly gloomy evening when it was raining heavily outside and the wind was whistling through the narrow streets of Cologne. Captain Neumann was on the radio with headquarters. "Cologne Station, this is Neumann. We have indications that this is a nationwide phenomenon. We have found evidence of similar rituals in Bedburg, in the Black Forest, and here in the Cologne area. I demand that a special unit be put together to thoroughly investigate this threat. Repeat, the danger is not local. It is national, perhaps even international." These words echoed in me as if they carried a dark prophecy. The more we researched, the more it turned out that the occult activities of the Nazis were not only taking place in isolated abandoned buildings, but also in the remains of industrial plants and former factories on the Moselle. In an abandoned textile factory in Trier, we found strange arrangements of metal parts and devices that did not fit with the usual production processes. The reports of these operations were characterized by such coolness that they seemed almost clinical. Yet, in every word, one sensed the suppressed fear of something that could not be explained. When the investigation finally seemed over, I still felt a sense of unease. It was as if all the evidence and reports formed a single, dark mosaic, the completed picture of which remains hidden from me to this day. In my mind, the words of the reports, the silent radio messages, and the countless glances we exchanged that night echoed. Glances that said, "There is something here that we will never fully understand." It was one of those nights when the cold wind whistles through the streets of Detroit, and the shadows on the walls of the old brick buildings look like living witnesses of times gone by. I remember how I, David, first learned of the family secret years ago as a young man, and how it has never left me since. My grandfather, once a man of dark heritage, had served in the Waffen-SS during the turmoil of World War II. His scars, not only visible externally, 2 lost fingers adorned with a silver wound badge, spoke of a time long past but never forgotten. After emigrating to the United States in the 1950s, he had worked for General Motors in Pontiac, Michigan, a testament to a life that moved between 2 worlds: the brutal reality of war and the supposed new beginning in America. His late transformation into a true American, proudly securing a well-kept house in the suburbs, an extensive hunting ground in the north, and an old '66 Corvette, was as fascinating as it was contradictory. After his death last week from an acute lung disease, I, as the oldest grandson, found something that changed his legacy forever. The key to a mysterious locker that no one in the family had ever spoken of. On that gloomy day, when the funeral took place on a rainy November night, I met an old man with a limping gait, whose piercing gaze and difficult-to-understand German accent immediately made me feel that something was wrong. "So, you're David's grandson, aren't you?" he said, and his name was Jonas. At first, he seemed friendly, almost concerned, but when he offered me a thick yellowed envelope demanding $5,000 in exchange for the key, his gaze changed to something cold and ruthless. His words, transmitted over the radio in a monotone, almost mechanical tone. "This is an offer you don't want to refuse, young man," sent a shiver down my spine. I refused to sell the key because I knew that my grandfather wanted me to discover the secret in that locker myself. The old man's words, "You're making a big mistake," echoed in my mind for a long time as I made my way to the bank's secure but eerie vault. The vault, cold and sterile, smelled of old paper and a hint of rust when I opened the small compartment S32. A slight hiss escaped the sealed container, and inside I found a pristine copy of Mein Kampf, almost the size of a modern paperback. Among the yellowed pages, I spotted a faded photograph of a man in black uniform, reminiscent of a time when ideologies determined the fate of entire nations. Behind the photograph was a handwritten note in what I initially thought was German, but was actually Finnish, and the words Louis, SS Panzerjäger Battalion, 6 Nord, in winter 1942, made me freeze. What could this mean? In the book's marginal notes, I found more cryptic references, notes that told of battles, of relentless cold shocks, and of mysterious events that had taken place in the misty forests of Scandinavia and in the frosty border regions of Russia. As I was still pondering this find, another key fell into my hands. This one marked S33, which the attentive security guard handed over to me after noticing that it had fallen out of the book. Curious, I returned to the locker shelf and opened S33. Another blast of cold air escaped, and inside that small compartment I found a leather-bound journal and a thin cardboard box containing a small booklet. The clock ticked away steadily in the silent darkness of the vault as I began to study the pages of the diary. The handwriting was old and hesitant, and the accounts it contained were more than mere military records. They seemed to reveal the dark inner workings of a man torn between loyalty, fear, and guilt. In the first entries, I read about the time when my grandfather, then a young recruit, joined the Waffen-SS because he was too small to be accepted into the regular army. He reported how his unit almost killed a British soldier during the invasion of Norway, just because the freezing wind made him tremble. This was followed by detailed reports about campaigns in Finland, the tense atmosphere on the frozen riverbanks, and the inexplicable events in dense forests near Zapolyarny. The words poured out almost unstoppably onto the pages. Reports of night patrols that froze the breath in the bitter cold, of radio conversations that reported on the Wehrmacht's realistic procedures. Alpha 3, report your position over the radio, and reports in which the soldiers described eerie noises and a constant, inexplicable knocking, as if someone or something were scratching at the armored screens. I still remember a transmission that I later followed from the local police station in Pontiac. An officer reported to headquarters via radio. "We have a case with possible overlaps to old military secrets. There are indications of hidden records and testimonies that remained hidden for decades. I repeat, this is a legacy from dark times. These official protocols, as sober and technical as they sounded, underscored the fact that my personal destiny was inextricably linked to that fateful era. The days passed in a kind of surreal fog as I tried to translate the diary and reconstruct the fragmentary entries. The first pages were marked by the cold of the Arctic winter and a life dominated by constant fear and mistrust. I read about a girl who lay in the shadow of the Finns, whose eyes sparkled in the darkness like stars, and about a boy, barely 13 years old, who lost his sight on a night of horror when he discovered the bloody remains of a tent camp. With each line, I felt the cold breath of the past wafting through the pages and conjuring up the horror of those days. The reports became more intense, and the more I read, the more I felt myself being drawn into that dark world, as if fate itself was giving me a personal command to solve the mystery my grandfather had left behind. As I sat in my small, gloomy study in a Detroit suburb and continued to study the diary, I suddenly heard a faint noise, almost like distant radio calls. On my old radio, a relic from the days when I had worked in the local police station next to the archive rooms, messages flashed up. Control, this is Unit Delta. We confirm unusual activity in the area of the old industrial plants in Pontiac. Repeat, this is potentially historical evidence, possibly connected with military secrets. These radio messages, as sober and technical as they sounded, brought the image of those distant, dangerous days back to my heart. It was as if the past were speaking directly to me over the radio, urging me to dig deeper. I began to systematically search through all available records, police reports, old radio logs, even local newspaper archives. There were reports of strange incidents in the Pontiac area in the 1980s, an abandoned storage room where old SS documents were found, a mysterious message that had been transmitted over the city's old radio network, and rumors of a man who lived in the shadows and was said to still be in contact with veterans of those dark days. Every detail added another horrifying piece to the puzzle. I also received a tip from a retired investigator with the local police department who called me and said, "David, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I found something in the old case files that might be related to your family. There was a mention of a secret meeting place in an abandoned industrial complex near the old GM plants. You might want to check it out." His voice was calm, almost indifferent, but the undertone was clear. Something lurked here that went far beyond mere historical relics. As I continued my own research, the story took on an almost cinematic turn. In the dusty archives of an old military depot in Stuttgart, which I managed to access through a series of coincidental connections, I found more records. These documents were fragile and difficult to read, but they spoke of secret operations and of a man named Helmut Kruger, who apparently was in close contact with my grandfather. In a hastily transmitted radio message, it said, "Kruger to Delta. Objective, secure the legacy. Repeat, the legacy is the key to the truth." The connection between these words and the reports in my diary haunted me. It was as if the shadows of the past revealed a piece of the truth in every radio transmission, in every yellowed document. A truth so dark that it wore down the mind. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to fall into place. An abandoned warehouse in Pontiac, where secret meetings were once held. Mysterious radio transmissions, real police reports, and the diary I held in my hands. I traveled to the region several times, meeting former soldiers, archivists, and even survivors whose memories of the war were filled with fear and terror. An old veteran I met in a small cafe in Detroit told me, "I heard the call back then that they still walk in the dark forests of northern Michigan, as ghosts of a time that never passes. Some say they are cursed, others that they are guardians of a secret that is too dangerous to reveal to the world." These words echoed in me as I lay in my room at night, reading the diary again. Every page seemed imbued with a touch of the supernatural, as if the pain and fear of those days lived on through the words. The cold reports of brutal fighting, the hazy descriptions of an unidentifiable creature attacking the soldiers with its razor-sharp claws, and the eerie radio messages, all this merged into a single, inescapable nightmare. I spent weeks gathering all the clues. In a remote storage room at the local archive in Detroit, I came across a folder of photos, old police reports, and even a handwritten transcript of a radio call that looked so authentic it could have been a modern police report. It said, "An unknown object, marked X13, was last seen near the old GM facilities in Pontiac. A witness reported that it looked as if it had stepped directly out of the shadows of the past, as if the ghost of a man who served in the deepest depths of the SS had risen again." The files also contained a report of a night raid in an abandoned industrial complex in the 1970s. Police officers had heard strange noises there during a routine operation, which echoed like ghostly echoes over the radio. "Delta 12, report," was heard in one of the logs, followed by an abrupt interruption of communication. The official explanation remained vague, and to this day the case remains unsolved. The deeper I delved into these dark archives, the more it seemed as if fate itself began to haunt me. Eerie shadows flitted across my vision, and nocturnal noises on the ceiling of my bedroom often woke me. It was as if the presence of my grandfather and all those who had once served in that war was creeping into my world. A world that had believed that time had buried the past, but the past had its own ways of coming back to life. Then, one rainy night, I received a call from the Pontiac Police Department. A young officer, his voice trembling, reported to me, "Mr. David, we have detected unusual activity in an old warehouse on Fifth Avenue. There are reports of strange radio transmissions and flashes of light. Please come by immediately. It could be related to your family history." The officer added, "We even have evidence that an unknown man in a German uniform was seen near the scene." When I heard these words, I suddenly realized that my grandfather's secret was more than just a historical relic. It was a living nightmare manifesting itself in the present. My journey now took me back to the abandoned warehouse. The place was surrounded by tall, rusting steel gates and overgrown walls that whispered stories of times gone by. As I entered the scene of the crime, I heard low, unintelligible radio messages in the background, which were acknowledged by the officers at the control center. "Alpha Bravo, are you at the scene? Confirm sightings. Over and out." The atmosphere was electric, permeated with a sense of constant observation. In one corner, I found old, dusty SS emblems and documents with cryptic messages that made my blood run cold. The investigators on site, all in pristine uniforms and with stern expressions, proceeded methodically. They secured evidence, took samples of the mysterious metallic particles scattered across the floor, and meticulously documented every detail. I watched as a senior investigator, Captain Mueller, an experienced man who had heard many a creepy story, kept in radio contact with headquarters. "Headquarters, this is Captain Mueller. We confirm the presence of unidentifiable objects. Please send reinforcements. Over." The realism of these meticulous police processes left no room for fantasy. It was as if the old ghosts of my grandfather and his comrades were reflected in the modern investigations, as if they had not passed away but were just waiting to be rediscovered. The hours passed in an endless maelstrom of flashes of light, cold rain, and the constant hum of radios. Between the investigation and the flashing memories in my diary, every sentence seemed alive and brooding with fear. I began to realize that the past is not silent. It calls, it haunts, and it demands to be faced. In that moment, as the rain pelted against the broken windows of the warehouse, and the wind blew through the aisles like an ancient lament, it was clear to me. My grandfather's legacy was a dark legacy that went far beyond personal memories. The night took its course, and while the investigators meticulously secured every clue, a disturbing question crept into my mind. Was all of this just a coincidence, or did those mysterious, ghostly voices and eerie radio messages have something to do with the dark secrets of the SS? As I drove back home, counting the raindrops on the windshield, the words of old Jonas echoed in my head. His warning that I would make a grave mistake if I delved too deeply into my grandfather's fate. But I couldn't help myself. The legacy, the traces, the reports, they all called out for a truth so disturbing that it shook the very foundations of my life. In the days that followed, I began to dig even deeper into the archives, my research taking me from the cold, gloomy streets of Detroit to the abandoned warehouses of Pontiac's industrial past. Everywhere I went, I seemed to see my grandfather's footsteps, in old telephone records, in radios that still occasionally sent strange messages, and in the eyes of people who remembered times gone by as if humming a long-forgotten melody. Every night when I was alone, I heard the steady tapping, as if invisible hands were tapping on my windows, and I wondered, was it the past that could not rest, or was it something else hiding in the shadows? The more I learned, the more I realized that behind the seemingly random find in my grandfather's locker was a much larger, more sinister secret, one rooted in the darkest chapters of human history. The thought of the horrific events recorded in that diary mingled with the real investigations and led to a painful realization. The old scars of war had never truly healed. The ghosts of the past, be they victims or perpetrators, had found their own ways of re-entering the present. And so, there I was, surrounded by evidence so authentic and disturbing that it could drive any sane person mad, wondering, what if the shadows of those days live not only in old documents but also in all of us, who have forgotten that we can simply ignore the cries of the past? It slowly dawned on me that my personal nightmare had just begun. As the storm raged outside and the rain transformed the streets of Detroit into a dark mirror, I knew that I was about to embark on a journey that would take me deep into the depths of history and into the depths of my own soul, in search of answers that might have been better left hidden. The following events led me to an abandoned estate on the outskirts of Pontiac that had once served as a secret meeting place for former SS members. I still remember the day I arrived there vividly. The sky was gray, the air heavy with the threat of a storm, and the dilapidated mansion seemed to hold the dark secrets of times gone by within its crumbling walls. In front of the building stood a rusted truck, its cabin windows emblazoned with faded words like, "Trust is the first step to betrayal," words that sent a shiver down my spine. Inside the estate, everything was in a miserable but strangely orderly state. Old, yellowed photographs, military badges, and forgotten letters hung on the walls. It was as if time itself had been frozen here. I entered, and the weak glow of my flashlight revealed layers of dust collecting in the corners and writings that told of past battles and lost souls. On a large oak table lay an old radio, connected by cables that were embedded in the walls like veins. A makeshift note on it read, "Back to the truth. Those who know the past cannot deny the future." As I wandered through the abandoned estate, I suddenly heard footsteps. It wasn't the wind whistling through the broken windows, but real footsteps. Instinctively, I pressed myself into the shadows, my heart pounding. A figure, dressed in a faded military uniform, was walking leisurely down the long hallway. His gait was heavy, almost ritualistic, as if he weighed each step for a long time. His voice, as he spoke into an old rough radio, was barely more than a whisper. Delta. Report in. We are now advancing into the next sector. Do you copy?" The voice was cold and distant, sending cold shivers down my spine. I followed the figure in the distance, hidden in the darkness, and listened to the radio messages echoing in the damp, stuffy air. Meanwhile, the local police had stepped up their investigation. Captain Muller, the lead investigator, had since secured the abandoned property as a major crime scene. Over the radio, I heard him speak in sober military instructions again. "Alpha Bravo, secure all entrances. We suspect that documents and evidence from the early years of the war are stored here. All units, check the rooms over the radio." The stark, matter-of-fact language of the police contrasted sharply with the eerie silence of the place, which seemed filled with my grandfather's own ghostly memories. As the hours passed, I discovered an old safe in a hidden room under the estate. With trembling hands, I inserted the key that I had once received from Jonas. The vault creaked open, revealing a collection of documents, photographs, and personal items dating back to the Second World War. Among the documents were detailed operational plans, reports of military operations in Finland, and even secret messages received via an old radio. One particularly disturbing report described an operation in the snowy forests of northern Michigan, in which a small squad, consisting of veterans, Finnish volunteers, and a mysterious boy, encountered an enemy that seemed to be from another world. The reports mentioned an X-13, a code that kept cropping up and which, in view of the evidence I was seeing, now opened up a chilling interpretation for me. The atmosphere in this secret room was electric. Every breath seemed to conjure up the past. I could almost hear the desperate cries of the soldiers, the metallic clang of weapons, and the incessant rhythmic pounding that had been described as ominous in the reports. In one of the documents, there was a message printed on an old, brittle, photographic paper. "We were betrayed. The shadows know no peace." If you are reading this, you have been chosen to continue the legacy. These words sent a shiver down my spine and led me to the realization that my grandfather had felt more than just the pain of war in his last moments. He had left a dark premonition that would now also determine my life. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a shrill alarm. Police officers flooded into the room, their faces tense as they secured the area. Captain Miller's voice came over the radio again. "All units, red alert. We have movement on the upper floors. Be vigilant, it could be hostile intruders." The tension was palpable, and in that moment I understood that my heritage was not just a relic of past atrocities, but also a living, breathing nightmare reflected in the shadows of modern investigation. With a pounding heart and a mixture of fear and determination, I left the estate, while outside the rain pelted incessantly on the pavement. I knew this was just the beginning. The clues, the evidence, and the eerie radio messages had shown me that the veil that lay over the past was slowly lifting. But what exactly was underneath it? Who were the shadows that still lurked in the abandoned corners of Pontiac and Detroit? And above all, what role did I play in this dark game between memory and forgetting? As I got into my car and turned the key in the ignition, a final message flashed on the dashboard, flickering in clear, cold letters. X-13. The legacy is watching. In that moment, as the engine started and I drove off into the rain-drenched darkness, I knew I had to find answers, whatever the cost. Yet deep inside, a foreboding question stirred. Was I truly ready to discover the truth, or would I be lost in the shadows of the past myself? As the city lights faded in the distance and the rain transformed the asphalt into a glittering carpet, I sensed something dark stirring inside me, a premonition that my grandfather's story was far from over, and that the shadows of the SS, who had once ruled over Europe, were now awakening again in the cold nights of America. I continued driving, the wind whispering incomprehensible warnings to me, and somewhere in the distance I heard the knocking sound again, as if someone or something was waiting for me to take my next step. The next few days dragged on in an oppressive silence, interrupted only by the sporadic radio transmissions of the investigators and the mysterious messages that continued to come to me via my old radio. It was late in the evening when I returned to the rundown office of the Pontiac Police Department. Captain Muller was sitting at a large wooden table, surrounded by meticulously documented files, maps, and old radio logs. His eyes, marked by years of disappointment and pain, fixed me as he began without further ado. "David, we have discovered something here that directly matches the reports in your diary. There are indications of a secret base that, believe it or not, is still in operation, albeit underground." He opened a thick folder and handed me a copy of a report dated early morning, November 15th, 1987. The document had handwritten notes in faded ink, accompanied by grainy photographs of a deserted industrial complex in the suburbs of Detroit. "We detected radioactivity indicating communication that was thought to have been lost for decades," he said in a deep voice. The message was short but clear. X-13 is active. The past is alive. As we sat in the dimly lit room, the old radio on the desk suddenly flickered as if it had activated itself. A static voice, almost a whisper, sounded, "Delta, get into position. The time of silence is over." It was as if the voices of the past were speaking directly to us. Captain Muller stared into the device, and his expression changed from surprise to sheer fear. "That's impossible," he murmured. "The signal is from the 1940s. How can it still be active here and now?" I remembered my grandfather's words, which sounded in the pages of his diary, as if they were directed to the future. These words had accompanied me all these years, and now they seemed to finally fulfill their eerie destiny. Captain Muller continued, "We also have reports of a man calling himself Helmet, a former officer who supposedly lives in the depths of the industrial complex. He is said to be the key to all this, and according to the files, there have been repeated radio transmissions mentioning him. We need someone to venture into this abandoned area and provide us with more information." His voice dropped as he added, "I believe that your grandfather was connected to this Helmet. It's as if a dark legacy he left behind is still haunting him, and you're the only one who can end it now." The case developed at a rapid pace. In the hours that followed, I repeatedly received encrypted messages over the radio that spoke of a mysterious unit operating in the abandoned warehouses. A short, clear radio signal, Delta 13, "Confirm your position, end of radio," echoed through the room, and I felt my heart race incessantly. Each of these radio messages was like an ominous countdown that inexorably pulled me into the maelstrom of truth. On a stormy night, as the rain lashed against the windows and the wind howled in the streets of Detroit, I set out with a small team of investigators to the industrial complex. Our objective was clear. We had to find out what this secret base was all about and how it was connected to my grandfather's dark past. The streets were empty, and the light from the headlights painted fleeting images on the wet asphalt. We were all aware of the danger that awaited us, and yet none of us could suppress the urge to get to the bottom of the mystery. We arrived at the abandoned building, which stood like a silent witness to past atrocities amidst rusting metal structures and overgrown walls. Armed with flashlights, we searched the grounds. In a secluded courtyard, we found evidence of secret operations: old, chipped SS insignia, rusted radio equipment, and scattered documents. One document, dated November 20th, 1941, described in detail how a unit under the command of a lieutenant had encountered something that didn't appear to be from this world in the dense forests of northern Michigan. The words were so precise that they made the reader believe that they had been part of that fateful battle themselves. Suddenly, there was a crackling sound behind us, and we turned around quickly. A dark figure emerged from the shadows. It was Helmut, just as he was described in the files. A broken but still formidable man whose eyes were filled with a deep melancholy and an ominous foreboding. He slowly raised his hand and signaled us to remain calm. With a voice as rough as the wind sweeping across the desolate terrain, he said, "You seek the truth, but are you willing to pay the price? The past has its demands, and it knows no mercy." His words, which were confirmed again over the radio, "Helmut to Delta, confirm your identity." Over, left no doubt that this was no figment of our imagination. Helmut led us to a hidden bunker beneath the complex, where the air was heavy with musty smells and old secrets. In this bunker, artifacts were found that indicated experiments had been conducted here since the 1940s. Experiments that dealt with a dark force that went far beyond mere military brutality. Photographs, documents, and even an old, creaking dictation machine, on which radio messages from times long past were stored, painted a picture that was so surreal and threatening that it took our breath away. Helmut began to tell us a story in fragmented sentences, of secret meetings, of fateful radio transmissions, and of a curse that haunted all those involved in these dark machinations. He spoke of an incident in which a young soldier, barely older than the boy in question, had disappeared without a trace one fateful night in the forest. The reports noted that he was last seen standing before a shadowy object that looked like a grotesque mixture of machine and human, a remnant of a failed experiment that was lost in time but never disappeared entirely. Helmut murmured, "X-13, that's the name of the demon we conjured up. It was he who betrayed us, who wiped us out." The words sounded as if they were coming from another dimension, as if they embodied the curse itself. As we sat there, enhanced by the diffuse light of a single bulb, another radio message reached us. This time, it was not Captain Mueller, but an unknown station warning us, "Delta 13, do not break contact. You are approaching the line between life and death. Remember, trust is deadly." The eerie warning silenced everyone in the room, and I felt cold sweat running down my back. What had begun as a simple investigative mission had turned into a nightmare in which past and present mingled ominously. Helmut finally showed us an old, dusty room with a giant mural on the wall, a symbol that looked like 3 intersecting lines, similar to a snowflake pattern that was woven into my family's history. This symbol was everywhere, on old uniforms and yellowed files, and on the last pages of my grandfather's diary. It was the sign of a pact that could not be broken, a pact sealed in blood. The investigators documented every corner of this room, while I stood still, barely able to suppress the feeling that I was witnessing a truth that was too great and too dark for me to fully comprehend. I still vividly remember the gloomy ride when I arrived in Rudesheim in a rickety taxi on a rainy afternoon. The streets glistened wet in the dim light, and as the car trundled slowly along narrow lanes lined with ancient, half-timbered houses, there was a sense of oppression in the air, something hard to describe, as if the shadows of times gone by lurked around every corner. The driver, an elderly gentleman with deep wrinkles on his face, only whispered quiet German words that I barely understood, but his eyes revealed that he knew more than he was revealing. In this city, whose name floated like a ghostly breath through my memory, even the rain seemed to want to wash away the guilt of days gone by. When I finally stopped at an old, time-worn building with faded signs like coffee and cake, I knew I had reached the place where the past mixed with the present. Inside, an almost eerie sight greeted me. The room was small and plain, but every corner seemed to tell a story. Faded photographs hung on the walls, showing scenes from a bygone era, people in uniforms, weather-beaten faces and eyes full of pain and secrets. Behind the counter stood Hans Dietrich, a burly man with a stern gaze and a white mustache that almost felt like a relic from another time. Without much hesitation, I transmitted the password that had been sent to me in a cryptic telegram. Sanguine. With a barely audible nod, he led me to a room at the back with an old carpet on the floor. When he pulled the carpet aside, a hidden entrance revealed itself to me. A creaking trapdoor system marked by the time and dust of the years. With a quiet, quick, and a hand gesture, he indicated that I should descend. My footsteps echoed on the stone steps as I descended into the darkness, into an underground passageway that branched like a labyrinthine tunnel into the depths of history. The dim corridor led me to a small, musty room, where the light of a single, dimly flickering lantern fell on an old wooden table. At this table sat a man whose appearance seemed like a contradiction. His skin was sallow, almost ghostly, and his tangled, snow-white hair shimmered in the pale light, while his eyes, lively and burning, stared at me with a mixture of pain and determination. He asked me to sit with him, and without hesitation I took a seat. Between us lay not just a simple table, but a fine line between times, a place where confessions and secrets mingled. His tone was calm, almost narrative, as he began to recount events beyond the power of imagination. "I have waited a long time for this moment," he said with a hint of sadness in his voice, "because the shadows of the past have haunted me for too long." Time stood still as I listened, spellbound. He told of those dark days in 1945, when the mighty regime under Hitler began to crumble, and the Allies were advancing inexorably. He spoke of his own experiences as a member of the so-called 4th Jaeger Division, a unit designed to keep the so-called enemies of the Reich in check. With each account, he seemed to look deeper into the depths of human cruelty, and the room was filled with an atmosphere imbued with guilt, remorse, and unimaginable pain. His voice trembled as he recounted how he had once received the infamous order to bring all Jewish residents to so-called collection camps. Camps that history never mentioned in most American history books. Camps that existed in the shadows of the well-known concentration camps. The research concentration camps, as they were called. The story gained intensity as he spoke of the gruesome experiments that took place in these secret facilities. In dull but forceful words, he described how the infamous Franz Zimmermann, a scientist of the occult, researched the opening of portals to other worlds under the strict supervision of Heinrich Himmler, whose name was whispered in the corridors of power and etched in the minds of those who had lost themselves in the deepest corners of terror. He told how Zimmermann worked in a laboratory that seemed to have sprung from a nightmare, a place where not only the human mind, but also the souls of the victims were consumed. He spoke of agonized screams, of cold blood, and of an eerie cold that could be felt even on the warmest summer nights. His eyes flickered as if the memories were catching up with him and drawing him into a maelstrom of guilt and retribution. In the midst of his narrative, authentic radio messages mixed, which he seemed to quote from times long past. Clear, popping voices that echoed in the corridors of the former police command centers in Rudesheim and also in the secret archives of the military administration. Alpha 3 to Bravo 7, situation escalated. Repeat, situation escalated, echoed the memories of that night's radio communication, when screams and radio messages set the rhythm of horror. He spoke of real police stations in Wiesbaden and Mainz, where officers in thick uniforms and with tense expressions tried to contain the chaos while he himself was caught in an internal struggle between the urge for revenge and the burden of guilt. Each and every one of these memories seemed like a fragment of a broken mirror, reflected in his words and drawing the image of a man who was once a simple soldier and whose heart was torn to pieces by the relentless reality of war. As I listened to his words, the images of burning camps, the deafening crashes of exploding buildings, and the whispering voices of those calling for help in the darkness mingled in my mind. He spoke of a night so cold and clear that the stars themselves seemed to mock humanity. It was a night when, driven by an insatiable urge to rise up against injustice, he held his father-hunting knife in his hand and secretly crept through the ranks of the waking SS men. I could almost hear the soft ringing of the blade as it cut through the silent darkness, while the radio repeatedly transmitted orders. Delta 5, moved to the camp immediately. His account was interspersed with details that revealed meticulous planning, from the secret routes, the key handovers, and the meticulously scheduled timetables of the guards. He also told of the moments when he felt compelled to betray the identity of his own blood by posing as a loyal Nazi, even though his heart still beat with that of his true origins. He spoke in a low, almost resigned voice as he recounted how he secretly smuggled food to the starving prisoners and, with a trembling voice, coaxed the whispers of thanks from them. "Thank you, Mr. Meller," they had often said, and those words had burned into his conscience while he simultaneously endured the cruel stares of the SS men. Every minute he spent in that labyrinth of suffering and madness left scars deeper than any visible wound. The description of that night, lost in the shadows of the warehouses, was accompanied by the dull echoes of shattered dreams and the monotonous hum of the electronic devices that set the pace of death. In the light of the flickering lantern, I realized that every sentence he spoke was not only a report of past deeds, but also a constant memorial that echoed in the quiet corners of humanity. I almost heard the sound of metal, as if the weight of an uncountable history weighed on us. And as the old man continued, a sense of eerie foreboding crept into my being, as if this tale carried not only a past reality, but also a dark shadow into the present, one that would resonate for a long time to come. The man's voice grew quieter, and his words began to fill with an almost imperceptible melancholy. He told of the painful night in which he, driven by a feeling that wavered between despair and anger, decided to fight injustice with all his might. "It was August 4th, he whispered, his eyes beginning to blink with inner torment, "when I decided enough was enough." He recalled how he had secretly snuck out of the guardhouse as darkness fell over the camp and the radio messages in the distance sounded like distant thunderclaps. "Alpha 3 to Bravo 7. We have detected an anomaly," his memories resounded, as he moved through narrow corridors, echoing with the silent screams of the prisoners. It was as if time itself had stopped, and every step he took resulted in the echo of relentless retaliation. In those moments when the blood in his veins seemed to boil, he devised a plan so bold and desperate that he could hardly believe it himself. Using his father's knife, an heirloom that reminded him of better times, he began to make his way through the ranks of sleeping guards. His steps were light, almost ghostly, and when he finally reached the Central Command Center, he heard the muffled words of a radio operator. "Bravo 7. We have movement in the camp. Confirm the sighting." These words, which sounded like a threatening echo in his ears, prompted him to make his decision. He knew that this was the moment when he would either become a legend or be condemned forever. The plan was meticulously worked out. He had painstakingly studied the patrol routes, mapped every key, every door, and every hidden passage. In the flickering light of the emergency lighting, I could almost feel the tension in his voice as he described how he hid in the shadows of a warehouse and then suddenly emerged to overpower the sleeping guards with quick, precise movements. There were radio messages accompanying his operation. "Delta 5, I have a target." Repeat, "Target secured." He described how he crept past the prisoners, saw their horrified looks in his reflection, and memorized every single promise that he would never allow more innocents to suffer. Every step he took was marked by an inner struggle, between the anger he felt and the realization that his actions could never undo the horrors he had witnessed. His voice trembled as he spoke of the final confrontation, how, in a moment of sheer frenzy, he had seized the SS's weapons and lost himself in a whirlwind of blood and screams. With brutal determination, he had disarmed one of the officers whose radio became a last desperate call. "Alpha 3, we need immediate assistance. This is an emergency." The words echoed for a long time in the damp, cold corridors as he made his way through the hordes of perpetrators, always accompanied by the incessant radio chatter and clanking orders of the police, who soon arrived. The room he was now sitting in seemed to fill with the ghosts of the past. Every memory, every scar inside him seemed like a living testimony to those nights when the unimaginable had happened. The story he was telling was not a fairy tale, but a raw, unembellished account of violence and human fragility. As he described the details of the final act of rebellion, the destruction of key points in the camp, the setting of explosives, all in a chaotic crescendo of light, noise, and death, I had the feeling that I was witnessing an indelible shadow that could never quite fade away. The account ended abruptly when he described one final disturbing image. He had watched the blazing inferno from a distance after successfully triggering the explosions, while radio messages such as Bravo 7 confirmed the loss of the camp hung in the air. The images of the flickering flames, the faces of the survivors, some grateful, others marked by unspeakable grief, merged into a single, indelible moment. I felt my heart grow heavy as he added in a trembling voice, "I have saved many lives, but I will never be able to shake the shadow my actions have cast." His words, carried by a melancholy and pain deeper than anything I could imagine, echoed in me as I stared into the darkness of the underground chamber, wondering if all the horror would ever truly end. The memories of this man, of his agony and his desperate struggle, remained with me like a curse. As I slowly left the room, accompanied by the low drone of radio chatter and the steady drip of water beating off the old damp walls, I realized that the story he had told me was just a fraction of a much larger, unceasing nightmare. The shadows of the past had remained alive, and in every dark corner of Rudesheim, in every abandoned building, the ghost of that cursed night still seemed to cry out for justice. I got back into a waiting car and drove, while the rain continued to drum relentlessly against the windows. In the rearview mirror, I saw the contours of the old city, bathed in a faint, blood-red light, as if the wounds of the past were reflected in the evening twilight. The old man's words, his confession, and his everlasting guilt haunted me. It was as if he had left me with an open ending, an unexplained mystery that forced me to question the truth behind the facades of this city. One last ominous question hung in the air. Was what I had heard really the end of a cruel chapter? Or did the nightmare live on in the dark corners of our souls? In the days that followed, as I tried to process the impressions of that night, a new, ominous veil began to settle over reality. I received calls from anonymous numbers whose scratchy voices in the background repeated unclear radio messages. Bravo 7, check the last report. There are further indications. Police operating in Rudesheim and surrounding cities such as Mainz and Wiesbaden reported unusual occurrences in dilapidated buildings, where the remains of those cruel nights were allegedly found. At official sites, files were combed through, and colleagues of mine, all documented in real, meticulously kept police reports, reported on clues suggesting that the events of the camp had never been fully closed. In a desolate warehouse on the outskirts of Rudesheim, which felt like a memorial to the past, investigators found traces of nocturnal radio messages and silent footsteps. An old radio, rusted and marked by time, had been discovered during a search warrant. The officer at the radio murmured into it. "Alpha 3 to all units, we have a signal. Repeat, we have a signal." This message, as mundane as it might sound, gave me the impression that the ghosts of the past were still lurking in the shadows, ready to strike again. The official report spoke of a series of strange, almost supernatural phenomena that investigators had observed in the abandoned rooms. Cold drafts, whispering voices that could not be identified, and the eerie feeling of being watched. As I sat in my small hotel room in Rudesheim and thought about these reports, I could not forget the old man's words. He had left me with a loose end, a question that echoed like a dark echo in my mind. Were the cries of the prisoners and the ghostly radio messages really over, or was this just the beginning of an unending nightmare that continued in the depths of the German night? The memory of the eerie radio messages and the clear voices documented by the police files, Bravo 7 report, suspicious activity in Sankt Goar, would not let go of me. Reality seemed to evaporate, as if the lines between what really happened and the ghosts of times past were blurring. I began to study old police reports and archived documents stored in dusty folders at the headquarters in Wiesbaden. There, I found evidence of a strange connection between the events at the research camp and current reports of unexplained phenomena. Some documents contained reports of disturbing radio transmissions and mysterious events that were never officially explained. These files seemed to be the traces of a ghost still roaming the abandoned corridors of the old warehouses. A ghost haunting not only the past, but also the present. The days passed in a strict rhythm of investigations and sleepless nights. The police intensified their search, using real radio messages and meticulously logged reports as a guide. During a nighttime operation in a remote industrial area of Mainz, I heard several units communicating with each other via radio. Delta 5 to Unit 12, please confirm. There is unusual activity at the old factory near the train station. These real, documented procedures, which I myself had witnessed, combined with the old man's stories, blurring the lines between fact and fiction. The dark veil of the past had once again covered the present, and in the silent hours of the night, when the radio messages echoed through the dark alleys, one could almost get the impression that someone, or something, was still lurking in the shadows. The investigation teams, consisting of experienced detectives, forensic experts, and old war veterans, followed the clues with the utmost care. Their conversations were sober, their words short and to the point, but behind those words lay an unspoken fear that could be seen in every glance. In an improvised operations center in an old military bunker, radio messages were monitored and recorded while an older investigator, whose voice trembled with years of experience, said over a radio, "Alpha 3 to all units. We need to investigate this connection immediately. Something is wrong here." These instructions, as direct and sober as they sounded, were the echo of a long-gone era that had become a curse in the corridors of power. And so, as I witnessed all this and was confronted with the reality of the cruel past and the signs of an ominous present, I was left with only one question. Were the cries of the lost and the radio messages of the past just fleeting memories, or the prelude to a nightmare that would repeat itself again and again in the darkest corners of our being? As I walked the empty streets of Rudesheim that foggy morning, accompanied only by the ghostly echoes of old radio signals, I sensed an ominous presence creeping into my innermost being. A presence that whispered to me that the end of that cruel night was not the end of the story, but only an unfinished, frightening prelude to something still lurked in the shadows. As I stepped out into the faint pre-dawn light, the old man's final words still echoed in my mind. I have saved so many lives, but the shadow of my guilt will haunt me forever. At that moment, I wondered if it was possible that this guilt and the pain associated with it could never completely disappear, whether it would manifest itself as an endless nightmare that lasted for generations. And in the murky reflections of the puddles, which captured the pale light of the early day, I saw in the eyes of the city itself the question that no one could answer. Was it all really over, or did the spirit of cruelty still live in people's hearts, ready to resurface at any moment? These thoughts, so urgent and ominous, haunted me as I slowly walked down the main street and heard the monotonous hum of police radios in the distance, a sound that reminded me that some ghosts never truly die. And so the circle of that dark night closed, and the memory of what had happened remained like an open, disturbing chapter in the chronicle of a dark past that was far from over. Amid this uncertain silence, in which reality merged with the shadows of the past, I was left with only one question. Was it possible that the nightmare I had witnessed could really come to an end? Or was it destined to rise again and again in the darkest nights and drag us all into the abyss? The answer remained hidden in the crevices of old walls and in the cold radio messages that echoed softly through the dilapidated alleys, while day slowly broke and the ominous whispers of the past faded into the darkness of the future. History, as revealed in these memories and reports, continued. An endless stream of pain, guilt, and indelible scars, entrenched in the winding streets of Rudesheim, and in the hearts of those who had witnessed these unimaginable horrors. The police radio messages, the sober protocols, the crackling sound of radio equipment, and the unmistakable silence in abandoned buildings merged into a single, urgent appeal. The truth about that night was not in the files or in the reports, but in the inexplicable shadows that still lurked in the darkest corners, ready to return at any moment and continue their cruel story. As the investigation progressed in the archives and the evidence found in dusty folders and on crumbling walls revealed a frightening mosaic, an eerie connection between the past and the present began to emerge. An old radio message recorded during a routine operation was mentioned repeatedly in the logs. Alpha 3, end of transmission. Stay alert. These words, as simple and sober as they sounded, had been burned into the police chronicles like a dark curse. They served as a reminder that the evil that had reached its peak during those nights could never be completely silenced. In an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Mainz, where the last remains of the victims were once secretly laid to rest, a team of experienced investigators conducted meticulous examinations. Under the dim lights of an improvised operations center, every move and every sound was meticulously documented. An old, rusted radio set, with a microphone so sensitive that it could pick up even the faintest whisper, repeated the same ominous orders over and over. Bravo 7, secure the area. Possible activity confirmed. The investigators, whose eyes spoke of years of experience and unspoken fear, knew that they were dealing not only with human perpetrators, but also with the ghosts of a terrible past. The days passed in a ceaseless rhythm of searches, meticulous documentation, and the hushed voices of the radio devices that echoed in the abandoned rooms. I myself could almost feel the eerie presence as I sat in an old cafe in Wiesbaden one evening, listening to the low voices of the officials. A young police officer, his voice trembling with nervousness, whispered into his radio, "Delta 5 to Unit 12. We've found something. Please confirm." The words were accompanied by a dull crackling sound, as if the walls themselves were whispering the story. In that moment, I realized that the evil that had once been hidden in the depths of a secret concentration camp could not be easily hidden in the shadows. It lived in the documents, in the radio messages, and in the quiet voices of those recorded in the police files. And so, as day turned to night, and the twinkling lights of the emergency vehicles could be seen in the distance, only one question remained. Was it possible that the incessant screams of the past, the radio messages, the evidence and the indelible scars, would ever come to a definitive conclusion? Or was this just the eerie prelude to a new chapter, still waiting to unfold in the cold, silent streets of Rudesheim? This question, so urgent and ominous, was left in the shadows as night fell, and the old man's last words echoed like a dark mantra in my mind. The shadow of my guilt will never fade. It began in the bitterly cold winter of 1943, when the cumbersome news of the war reached even the remote valleys of Upper Bavaria. I still remember the muffled footsteps of our company as we fought our way through the deep snow to a small, remote village near Garmisch-Partenkirchen, a place that was not marked on any official map but had been deemed strategically important by the Nazi authorities. The winter cold cut like razor blades into our skin, and the dense fog that crept in from the surrounding forests gave the landscape an ominous, almost supernatural atmosphere. During these days, when the front lines were little more than fleeting shadows, our squad was stationed under the command of Captain Friedrich Weber. He was a man of quiet, almost stoic nature, whose face was marked by the horrors of war and the relentless orders. But what no one could have known was that the real horror was not taking place on the known battlefields, but lurked in the quiet lanes and secluded corners of this village. The villagers, mostly older men and women, spoke in a rough, deep Bavarian dialect, and their eyes reflected decades of skepticism toward strangers. No sooner had we settled in than the first disagreement arose. In the small tavern where the locals gathered after a long day in the cold, a man named Johann, the only one serving in the village police, suddenly raised loud, trembling words in the direction of our men. "Where did you take the children?" he bellowed, his voice filled with equal parts desperation and fear. The sound of these words, so inappropriate and foreign in the midst of the disciplined commands of our company, made us all pause for a moment. A young private, who had been serving in these mountains for years and knew the Bavarian countryside, hastily translated. "The villagers claim that several children have disappeared without a trace. They want us to do something." Captain Weber responded with the cool efficiency of an officer who had learned to control himself, even in the darkest moments. He ordered all available men to remain on standby and set up a makeshift radio post in the converted village hospital. "Alpha 3, this is Weber. We have unrest in the village. Confirm if you have similar reports." His clear, deep voice crackled over the crackling radio, while the snow whipped incessantly against the old building. The answer came with an ominous silence, accompanied only by a soft, almost melancholy hissing sound, as if the world itself was holding its breath. In the days that followed, events took on grotesque proportions. At first, it was only the disappearance of small items, a piece of wood, an old rug, but soon it became much more serious. A villager reported that an old, handcrafted ceremonial halberd, once an heirloom displayed above the mantelpiece of an old hut, had mysteriously disappeared. The rumors grew louder as children continued to disappear from their beds. The lonely nights were punctuated by restless radio chatter and the muffled voices of the men who patrolled in a state of constant alert. Every night seemed to fall a new layer of horror over the village. I remember one particularly stormy night when the wind howled in the bare fir trees and the snow came down in thick flakes. Our radio crackled incessantly as messages came in about missing children and strange noises coming from the surrounding hills. "Bravo 7, repeat. Child missing by the old barn on the west side." It came through the static. The reply came only as a low, worried murmur, barely intelligible. It was as if the darkness itself was swallowing the words. As I sat at my post in a small makeshift bunker built into the basement of the former village school, I couldn't shake the oppressive feeling that something inexplicable and evil was lurking in the surrounding area. With each passing day, the tension grew. Captain Weber conducted meticulous investigations. He questioned the villagers, took witness statements, and documented every clue, no matter how small. The village police, led by Inspector Emil Roth, were brought in. Roth was a man who, during the chaotic times of National Socialism, had learned to hide his emotions behind a mask of duty, and his cool precision was evident in the meticulous protocols. Together with Weber and his men, Roth formed an unlikely but determined team, trying to solve the mystery of the missing children. Meticulous searches were carried out. Every hut, every barn, every secluded shed was inspected. Despite all efforts, the mystery remained unsolved, and fear spread like a cold shadow over the village. As the nights grew longer and the days shorter, the atmosphere took on a surreal turn. The radio calls we made were often interrupted and distorted, as if someone or something was trying to manipulate the communication. One evening, while on patrol with my comrades through the narrow, snow-covered lanes, I heard a voice on the guard's radio that sounded different from the others. "This is Delta 2. Repeat, we have suspicious noises near the old mill. Possible irregularities. Please report." The reply followed hesitantly and haltingly. "Delta 2, understood. All units hold position and secure the area." I felt the sweat running down my back despite the freezing cold as I listened to the silence after these words. It was as if the wind itself carried the last words of despair. The investigations escalated when, one frosty morning, a man named Carl, a young villager, was found dead outside the old village church. His face was frozen in an expression of unimaginable horror, and lying beside him was a bloodied, shattered piece of the aforementioned halberd. The police secured the scene, and Inspector Roth ordered a thorough search for clues. Radio messages were constantly being exchanged, and in the cool, gray morning hours, the monotonous sound of orders could be heard. "All units, please report. Suspicious activity within a 500-meter radius." There was an atmosphere reminiscent of a nightmare in which reality and madness merged. As the day turned into endless hours, more and more clues began to accumulate, pointing in a dark direction. Reports of eerie figures seen in the dark forests between the houses became louder. Some villagers claimed to have heard voices at night, words that could hardly be understood, as if someone were pleading in a forgotten, ancient language. These reports formed a mosaic of horror that slowly revealed the true extent of the abysses into which this village had become entangled. And while the Nazi authorities were conducting their own, often brutal investigations, it seemed as if someone or something was deliberately blurring the lines between madness and reality. The tense conversations over the radio, the flickering light of the lanterns in the snow-covered alleys, the constant crunching of the snow under the heavy boots, all this merged into an impenetrable fog of horror that seemed to crush people's souls. Captain Weber, who always remained sober and objective in his files and reports, could not deny that he sometimes sat alone in his quarters at night, thinking of the screams of the children that appeared to him in his dreams. It was a time when every minute counted, when every instruction from the radio, every crack of ice on the window panes, became part of an ominous ritual that threatened to drag the village into the abyss. The first phase of this sinister chronicle ended one day when the sky turned an unnatural red, and the last snow of the night floated to the ground in an inexplicable dance. We all stood there, silent and frightened, when suddenly a scream cut through the cold, a scream that seemed to suffocate the last spark of humanity in this village. Someone had found missing children again, but this time in a way that surpassed all previous atrocities. The scream echoed in our ears for a long time as we plunged into the madness of the night ahead. And none of us knew whether the horror would now finally take hold, or whether it was only the first act of a much darker drama. Darkness swallowed the day, and that night the real nightmare began. Radio messages became more incomprehensible, as if they were being sent from another world. "This is Delta 4. Repeat, we have found something." The words were abruptly interrupted, followed by a dull, crashing sound. When I tried to reach the transmitter again, all I could hear was a ghostly static. No one dared to use the radio again, and in the silence that followed, time itself seemed to freeze. In this first endless phase of horror, reality and delusion mingled, and we all knew that the abyss was drawing ever closer. It was as if the village, the people, and the war itself were intertwined in an inextricable web of despair from which there was no escape. I could feel the stares of the men, who stared blankly into the darkness as the shadow of the unknown grew ever larger. The eerie noises in the distance, the soft clanking of metal, and the incessant howling of the wind. All this seemed to tell us that something dark and powerful was awakening, something beyond our imagination. As dawn broke and the last radio message faded into the cold morning air, we thought that perhaps the sun would offer us some comfort. But instead, we were greeted by a new, even darker nightmare that seemed to merge with the awakening of the world. A nightmare that would continue to resonate in the depths of our souls long after that day. The next day dawned, but the cold and the screams of the night had left their mark. The police, led by Inspector Roth, began an intensive interrogation of the villagers. Between trembling hands and faltering words, incomprehensible hints kept coming to light. An old rumor that told of Nazi experiments in the hidden laboratories deep in the Bavarian mountains mingled with reports of missing children. "There is something that is not of this world," whispered an old woman whose eyes glistened with fear. Her words seemed to carry a dark foreboding, as if she knew that the evil lurking in these snowy valleys had a source far greater than the war machine. Radio communications intensified, and so did the search. Several local police patrol cars, accompanied by SS patrols, combed the area. Radio discipline was paramount, and all movements were carefully documented in strictly coded messages. Unit 12, take position at the old mill. Confirm visual contact, was one of the radio messages that remained vividly in my memory. We heard men communicating in tense, short sentences, with every sound an indication of the growing unease. It was as if the darkness itself took on a life of its own, and technology, once a symbol of modern warfare, suddenly seemed to convey the words of terror. As day turned to an endless gray, I felt the pressure in my veins grow. The streets of the village were deserted. The windows of the houses stared silently into the cold, and the thought of all those who had disappeared in the last few nights made my heart sink. Every touch, every whisper in the wind seemed to carry a message, a warning that the true enemy was not to be found only in the lines of the front, but lurked in one's own ranks. This realization, that even familiar faces could become monsters, fueled a deep, inner fear that even the most hardened soldiers could not shake. With each passing hour, the feeling grew that the line between order and chaos had finally been crossed. In a remote part of the village, near an abandoned farm, a patrol soldier discovered something he initially refused to believe. Amongst fallen wooden beams and in a half-decayed shed lay a yellowed piece of paper with the following message written in hasty, shaky handwriting. "The darkness is not far away. It lives within us." These words, simple as they were, had an effect that plunged us all into a state of paranoia. Was this a call for help? or a threat from those trapped in the depths of the nightmare? No one could say, and the uncertainty gnawed at us like the cold at our flesh. The hours dragged on, and as the snow fell outside in a ceaseless dance of life and death, we realized that the real horror had only just begun. The ominous silence, interrupted only by sporadic radio calls and the occasional creaking of old wooden floorboards, created an atmosphere in which every movement and every noise became a harbinger of doom. Captain Weber and Inspector Roth worked closely together, although both men were marked by an inner emptiness that was only intensified by the endless maelstrom of events. The days grew longer, and with them grew the gloomy premonition that the village might soon draw its last breath, and that the evil that was wreaking havoc here would soon reveal itself in full. As the day drew to a close and the leaden sky shone in a dull gray, the men gathered for the last radio contact of the day. "This is Unit 9. Please report your status," came the voice of an older soldier, whose voice trembled with exhaustion. A long pause followed, during which the only sounds were the swishing of the snow and the soft clanking of metal, until finally the answer came, short, concise, and permeated by an uncertainty that made us all look into the abyss. This night, it seemed, would change everything, and the darkness that hovered over us closed like a cold cloak around our souls. With the onset of darkness, the second chapter of this infernal nightmare began. The first signs that the horror was not only in the fleeting news but also in our own ranks became apparent in a seemingly ordinary incident. During a nighttime patrol that ended in a remote forest, Radio Echo 5 reported eerie noises that could not be reconciled with the natural sounds of the forest. We heard steps that did not belong to us," whispered the young soldier, whose voice was marked by a mixture of fear and disbelief. The order was given immediately. "All units, secure the position. Report any movement." And so we set out in the darkness to find the source of this ominous sound, unaware that our search would lead us directly into the heart of the horror. The snowflakes danced like ghostly spirits through the night, and every step on the frozen ground echoed in the silence. In the middle of the forest, surrounded by bare trees that towered into the sky like silent sentinels, I spotted tracks, footprints that were too large to have been made by a regular soldier, and that were pressed into the snow in an irregular row. With trembling hands and a pounding heart, I followed these tracks, while my radio kept picking up the voices of my comrades who were asking for confirmation over the radio in the distance. "This is Unit 11. We see something. Confirm visual contacts." The reply came in halting, barely intelligible sentences that reflected the growing desperation. The deeper we ventured into the forest, the more we felt as if something supernatural was in the air. A musty, almost putrid aroma hovered among the trees, and the darkness seemed to thicken as if it were alive. Suddenly, in the middle of this ghostly scenario, we came across an abandoned hut, half buried by snow and seemingly forgotten by time. Its broken windows and creaking wooden door told of times long past, times when belief in the supernatural had not yet been obscured by the harsh reality of war. Inside the hut, we found records written in a scrawly handwriting, diary entries of a man who had apparently worked as a scientist for the Nazi regime. His words spoke of secret experiments in remote mountain laboratories, of attempts to break the human psyche and turn it into a tool of destruction. It was as if he had tried to contain the darkness in a vessel that now wandered uncontrollably and furiously through the snowy valleys. One paragraph in particular stood out from among the dusty pages. "The horror we have unleashed lives on. It feeds on our fears and grows with every lost soul." These words sent a shiver down my spine and made me doubt the real reason for recent events. We had barely left the hut when another radio call came in. Delta 6 to all units. We have detected movement in the direction of the old mill. Please confirm immediately. The order was clear, and without hesitation the men moved in formation, weapons tightly gripped, faces tense with anticipation and fear. The route to the old mill led us through a narrow path where the snow lay in deep furrows, as if it wanted to keep the secrets of the previous nights. Every minute seemed to stretch as the heart pounded in the chest and the breath steamed in the cold air. When we reached the mill, a scene of horror revealed itself that burned itself into our memories. The entrance to the mill was surrounded by countless footprints leading in different directions, and in the middle of the snowfield lay an overturned car, its broken windows sparkling in the pale moonlight. It was as if the place itself had become a portal to another world, a world where morality and reason had given way to madness. Suddenly, the radio picked up. "This is Unit 3. We have a visual." A man, a uniformed man, moving strangely. The voice trembled with fear, and the silence that followed was deafening. We followed the shadow moving among the ruins of the mill, and the closer we got, the more time seemed to slow down. The man, a soldier whose face was marked by the burden of war, seemed lost, as if he could no longer distinguish between reality and delusion. In a brief radio message, which was little more than a stammering whisper, he reported, I don't know what's happening. It's as if darkness itself is calling us." Those words burned into my memory, and in that moment I realized that the source of the horror went far deeper than a few missing children or lost items. It was an ancient, evil power lurking in the depths of the Bavarian mountains, and it had only been further unleashed by the Nazi experiments. The hours passed in an endless swirl of radio commands, flickering light and the constant sound of snow. We continued our search, coming across abandoned stables, old bunkers, and mysterious tunnels that ran through the countryside like veins. In every corner we found a fragment of the truth, and at the same time another piece of the horror puzzle. Detective Roth, tirelessly pursuing every lead, gave the order to secure all evidence and send it immediately to headquarters in Munich. The strict protocols of the police were meticulously adhered to. Fingerprints, bloodstains, even the unusual nature of the snow were meticulously documented. And yet, every answer we found seemed only to raise new questions. It was late at night when the culmination of this ominous chapter emerged. In a remote valley, surrounded by steep rock walls, we discovered traces that led us to an underground facility, a secret laboratory built by the Nazis to carry out their darkest experiments. The door of the laboratory was bolted shut with heavy iron, and behind it seemed to reign a silence louder than any sound. With trembling hands and pounding hearts, we entered, armed with flashlights and an unwavering belief that this was where the horror had to lie. Inside, we found records of inhuman experiments, attempts to manipulate human consciousness, to break it and put it to the service of a dark plan. A device that looked like something out of the darkest nightmares stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by notes in a scrawly handwriting. On one of these sheets was written, "When man loses his innermost light, he becomes living darkness." These words, simple as they seemed, revealed the true essence of the Nazi madness that had been unleashed here. When we left the laboratory, it felt as if a part of us had been forever trapped in those dark corridors. Re-emerging into the open air was accompanied by a feeling of powerlessness and a deep realization that evil, in all its forms, could never be fully defeated. Our radios continued to crackle ominous messages, and every glance over our shoulders made us believe for a moment that unseen eyes were watching us. The day ended in an almost desolate gray, and as winter cast its cold veil over the village, each of us knew that we had witnessed something beyond human imagination. Night fell, and with it came a new, even more intense terror. It was as if the darkness itself began to speak in those hours. In short, disturbing radio messages, in the ghostly shadows that danced on the walls of our shelters. The last words I heard as I sat back at my radio were from a fellow soldier who whispered, "I see something that can't be here, something that will swallow us all up." These words stayed with me as I stepped out into the whipping winds and felt that the real night of horror was yet to come. As the hours turned into an endless silence, I realized that we were trapped in the middle of a nightmare from which there was no escape. A nightmare in which humanity was slowly being swallowed up by darkness, and every answer only led to new, disturbing questions. Then, in a fateful twist, a final radio message reached us that called everything into question. "This is Unit 8. Please confirm. Is there anyone who can hear the voice of a man who should long since be dead?" A shiver ran down my spine, and I knew instinctively that we were standing on the edge of an abyss from which there was no return. The cold that surrounded us suddenly seemed to come not only from outside, but also from within, as if an invisible enemy lived inside us. We had reached a point where the boundaries between madness and reality had finally been torn apart, and I wondered if there was any way out of this nightmare at all. Darkness closed in around us even tighter as the first rays of dawn barely lit up the sky. And with that, this second bleak stage of our incessant nightmare came to an end. The following days dragged on like endless shadows, and the village itself seemed to have fallen into an almost tangible silence, testifying to the omnipresent fear. Captain Weber and Inspector Roth gathered all the remaining men for a final, decisive search of the area. The instructions were clear. Every trace, every clue, no matter how small, was to be documented and immediately transmitted to the Central Command in Munich. The cold, clear radio traffic had become a lifeline, through which we tried to maintain some semblance of order in this world of horror. "This is Unit 10. Confirm. All units secure the area around the abandoned barn. Report any suspicious activity." It penetrated the frosty morning. The words were repeated with military precision, as if they held the key to a long-forgotten ritual. I remember the moment we arrived near the barn, an old, dilapidated building that once served as a granary. The doors hung crooked on their hinges, and the wind made them creak ominously as it blew through the cracks. At that moment, everything seemed to stand still, and I could almost hear the darkness beating. We entered with weapons drawn, each step on the creaking wooden floor an echo of desperation. Inside, we found nothing but traces of smoke and a faint burning light emanating from a small fire in the corner. But when we examined the fire, we came across something that paralyzed us all. A small leather envelope with handwritten notes inside. The words spoke of unspeakable suffering, of experiments that drove the human mind mad, and of a ritual to draw the souls of children into darkness. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to preserve the essence of the horror in this envelope. The hours that followed were marked by a feverish search that took us through the snow-covered hills. It was a race against time, as the cold and impending darkness put us under increasing pressure. Every now and then, we were interrupted by radio messages in which we heard incomprehensible noises and desperate voices. One particularly striking call was that of a young soldier, who announced in a barely audible whisper, "I saw something. It's as if the shadows are moving, as if they are reaching for us." These words echoed in the endless expanse of snow, leaving a bitter taste of desperation. As we wandered through abandoned fields and snow-covered forests, I sensed an inexplicable presence closing in around us, a feeling as if invisible eyes were watching us. Every instruction from the radio, every spoken word, seemed to be part of a larger context, as if the ghosts of the past and the dark experiments of the Nazis formed a single, relentless force. Captain Weber, who had always presented himself as a rock in the surf, seemed unusually pensive that day. His eyes reflected not only the cold of winter, but also a deep, inner fear. The fear that we had become witnesses to an evil far beyond anything we could ever have imagined. The hours passed in a crescendo of horror until we finally arrived at a remote hillside where the snow formed a natural cavity that looked like a secret entrance into the depths of the earth. With pounding hearts and strained eyes, we entered. In this dark, icy passageway, we found a disturbing collection of objects. Abandoned toys, clothing, and even small personal items that suggested that children, our children, had suffered a cruel fate here. The sight was so horrific that it plunged even the bravest of soldiers into a state of shock. In a short, incomprehensible radio transmission, someone tried to call for help, but the signal was lost in a deafening roar. With every discovery, every disturbing detail, the web of horror seemed to tighten. The documents we had found in the secret laboratory were supplemented by the tracks in the snow, a symphony of terror that unfolded before our eyes. Inspector Roth kept glancing furtively into the darkness, as if he were looking for answers in the shadows that were not accessible to him. And so, as if winter itself had conspired against us, the last radio signal of the day became a threat. "This is Unit 8. Confirm that you are ready for the next step. There is something you need to understand, something that defies reason." These words, so urgent and frightening, were to lead us into another, even darker phase of the nightmare. A phase in which every answer raised only further questions, and in which the real horror took root in the depths of our souls. As the day finally ended in a gloomy twilight, and the last rays of the setting sun bathed the landscape in blood-red shadows, it was clear to me. We had only grasped a fraction of the horror, and the real nightmare still lay ahead of us. The coldness inside me mixed with the freezing cold of winter, and as we struggled back to the village from the hellish slope, the question always echoed in my ear. Who or what is controlling this darkness? And whether we would ever find the answers that could free us from this endless, nightmarish labyrinth. As night fell and we gathered in the makeshift headquarters, there was an inescapable feeling that the darkness was not only outside, but also within us. The voices on the radio, the incessant sound of the snow, the scream of an unknown man, all this combined to form an ominous chorus that seemed to drive us mad. It was during these last moments that a final radio signal broke through. "This is Unit 8. The darkness has begun to lose its control. Are you ready to accept the truth?" An eerie silence followed, and then a bang, as if the last connection to us had been torn away. At that moment, as the darkness engulfed us completely, the question remained hanging in the air. What if the real horror was not only in the experiments or the actions of one individual, but in each of us, in the shadows of our own souls, crushed by the mercilessness of war? The silence that followed was unbearable, and as I sat there surrounded by the remnants of a nightmare, I knew that this was not the end. It was merely a harbinger of what was to come, a dark veil that descended inexorably over our souls, leaving us with the question, which of us will stand firm at the end of the darkness, and which of us will be lost in it? As the first faint glimmer of dawn lit up the horizon, all questions merged into a single, urgent riddle that would haunt us for a long time to come. And so, the village, the snow, and the incessant radio calls remained as silent witnesses to an adventure that was far more than just a war. It was a fight against the darkness within ourselves. The final moment of this terrible chronicle came on a night when even the moon seemed to flee in fear. A radio message that drove us all mad was received. "This is Unit 8. We have heard a voice that curses us all. It calls for redemption, but at what price?" These words echoed inside me as if they had come directly from hell. In that moment, I realized that the darkness that surrounded us did not come from outside, but from the deepest abysses of our own souls, from the shadows that the war and the terrible Nazi experiments had engraved in all of us. My grandmother was a very reserved woman, even when it came to her own family. She was a German girl, born in Silesia around 1925. That's about all we ever learned, all she wanted us to know. I suppose the war was especially cruel to her, and she lost whatever family she had. She never talked about it. She never talked about anything until the winter of 45-46 when she met my grandfather, an American soldier stationed in Bavaria. She had moved west, away from the Red Army, like so many other refugees. A whirlwind romance ensued, and she returned with him to the States in early 47. Though I'm sure that the desire to escape from a devastated, conquered nation that held nothing more for her played just as much a role as her love for Grandpa, not that I blame her. She was a very bright young woman, brighter than my grandfather, as he freely admitted. Once in the U.S., she attended university for a few years and studied physics. Grandfather claimed she actually knew John Wheeler and Hugh Everett, but she didn't like to talk about it. In the early 1950s, she abruptly dropped out of college and decided to take on the role of a proper American housewife. Grandpa himself discouraged her, saying she shouldn't waste a brain like that, but she said she was happy with him and didn't need to change the world to be content. So that was it. My father was born in 1960. He met my mother in 1990. And in 1999 they had me. I was never particularly close with either of my grandparents, and these, my paternal grandparents, lived in another state, so even less. And on top of that came my grandmother's already mentioned reserved nature. But grandmother and I shared one thing, a passion for history. Although she had studied physics at university and was a math genius, history was her true joy. She instilled in me a love of the past, and when we visited each other, we would spend a lot of time talking about Napoleon's armies, German foreign policy between Bismarck and the First World War, the Bolshevik Revolution, you understand. She had a seriously impressive memory. She would read a book once and then recount every detail from it with perfect accuracy. When I was about 12, my grandfather passed away, and my grandmother, ill with cancer, moved in with us. Unfortunately, just a year or two later, her brilliant mind began to fade. We still talked about history often, but she started making mistakes she never would have made a decade ago. She would mention battles that never took place, states that never existed, generals who never commanded. I recall once, when we were discussing World War I, she casually mentioned the Red Army's investment of Prague. I gently reminded her that Lenin's 1919 Western Offensive had been stopped at the gates of Warsaw. The Bolsheviks never reached Prague. She nodded. Right. She mentioned Alfred Hugenberg, whom she called the last chancellor of capitalist Germany. I reminded her that Hugenberg had never been chancellor. He had been sidelined shortly after the Nazis took over and faded into obscurity. She nodded. Right. In 2014, Grandma went into a hospice. It became clear that she didn't have much time left. She was, after all, about 90 years old. No, we never knew her exact age, not even her birthday. Like I said, she didn't talk about her life before my grandfather. Of course, we were all sad, but it was a kind of stern, austere sadness. Such was our relationship with her. She wouldn't have wanted much crying and sentimentality. One day, I think it might have been around the beginning of my sophomore year of high school in October 2014, we went to visit her since the doctors said that her condition had significantly worsened. We sat with her for a while, and then she asked if she could possibly see each of us individually. Me, my father, my mother, and my two sisters for a while. Of course, that was fine. I was the last one to arrive. When I entered the room again and sat down at her bedside, she asked me if I still liked history. I said yes, of course. And that was true. I still do. She told me she didn't have much time left. I said, of course I know. I think I was her favorite grandchild because we're both pretty outspoken. She asked me to do her a favor. Of course I said yes. Grandmother told me to go home and go up to her room and take down the old oak chest in her closet. Bring it to her as soon as possible. I did just that. It was an old, heavy thing she had brought from Germany decades ago. It wasn't even locked, but she hadn't told me I could open it, and I didn't want to overstep while she was dying. The next day, after school, I took a bus to the hospital, the chest in hand. I brought it to her, and she beamed. She asked me to open it. I did. Inside were a few things. At the top was a photograph of a pretty young woman I didn't know. Black and white, but good quality. I wasn't too surprised when she told me it was her, but I was surprised that she was in uniform. It wasn't a uniform I recognized. Her hair was tied back in a braid, she was smiling, and her arms were folded behind her back so I couldn't see the badge on her shoulder, just the edges of it. I could see a narrowed point and two converging lines. Maybe a floral epaulette. Grandmother, what kind of uniform is this? Lift the next item. It was heavy and wrapped in a bundle of greasy old rags. I almost dropped it when I saw that it was a pistol. I quickly pushed it back into the box and peeked over my shoulder. I'm pretty sure firearms aren't allowed in the hospital. Grandmother, why do you have a weapon here? My old service weapon. Waff. She never quite lost her German accent. Which service were you in? You were a soldier? A soldier for whom? I'll tell you a story you won't believe. But maybe these things in the box will make it easier for you to believe. She told me openly that she was not from this world. She was born in Silesia in the late 1920s, she said. But not our Silesia and not our 1920s. I won't go into the details of the timeline she described, because we must have sat there for hours while she went through it. And while she was doing that, she sounded completely lucid and not at all demented. The gist was that, as in our world, the Nazis had come to power in Germany. But World War II had started a few years later. Hitler had spanned Europe, just as he had in our world. Except, and this was the big fork in the road, he had then spanned the USSR as well. A few years later, in the early 1950s, after years of draining the British economy and weakening their famous navy, the Nazis finally managed to accomplish the impossible: invade and occupy the British Isles. My grandmother said she had been active in the resistance against the Nazis long before Hitler came to power. She fled Germany and went to Soviet Russia when the fight at home could no longer be continued, on to Great Britain when the Wehrmacht conquered the USSR. When Britain fell, she fled with thousands of others who could not bear life under the Nazi boot, on to South Africa, hoping to continue the fight from there. I asked her what the uniform was. She then said it was the uniform of the Joint Committee on Military Sciences, a joint research and development effort between the governments in exile of Britain and France, and a number of other countries fighting Nazi Germany. Since she had studied physics, she was recruited to the JCMS. The days grew even darker. The Nazis seized old French Africa and used it as a springboard to attack South Africa and beyond. Victory for the Allies became a pipe dream. But for one man, a Russian scientist, my grandmother said. She didn't name him, but she said that he was brilliant. Perhaps the most intelligent man who ever lived. He discovered that there are other worlds, perhaps an infinite number of worlds, running parallel to each other through eternity. And more importantly, he discovered how to travel between them. Grandmother told me to take the papers out of the box. They were thin onion layer papers, the kind used for sketching out plans. They were covered with wild, impossible equations and intricate blueprints. This meant nothing to me. I was a kid struggling to get a C grade in Algebra 2. That was the plan, she said. Their world, my grandmother's world, was lost. They couldn't fight anymore. So they would send someone, a single person, the primitive machine of the great Russian scientist could handle that, to another world. Our world. That world. Our world they called World 38. Ours was a world that had defeated the Nazis, and therefore knew the horrors that a Nazi victory would bring. My grandmother would be sent here with the blueprints for the good doctor's machine. Once here, she would convince our generals and statesmen of her mission, and, with the help of the great scientists of World 38, improve the transporter so that it could carry not just one person, but millions. Once that was done, the armies of our world could march into theirs and free them forever from Nazi tyranny. She had boarded the machine, she said, while artillery pummeled Johannesburg and the Waffen-SS at the gates despaired. Her colleagues would destroy the machine once she had gone through. They couldn't afford to have it fall into the hands of the Nazis. Only the blueprints she would bring with her to World 38 would remain. She had boarded the plane, knowing that it might not work, that she might die or worse. She had saluted her comrades. The room shook under the weight of the Nazi fighter planes, but it worked. She got off at our world in the spring of 1945. The Third Reich was crumbling. Hitler had shot himself. The Allies were advancing deep into Germany. It was terrible, full of death. But for her, it was almost utopian. Now she had a mission, to reconstruct the doctor's machine, to free her world. That's why she came to America, she said, though she insisted she loved my grandfather. That's why she had sought the wisdom of great physicists at America's prestigious universities. But it was hopeless. No one would believe her. No one would take her seriously. Not even Everett, the father of the many worlds interpretation, took the plans for her fantastic machine seriously. So she finally gave up, settled for a quiet life with my grandfather. I believed her. I did. How could I not? She was an old woman. She didn't make up stories, not to annoy her grandchildren. The tears in her eyes were certainly real. And how else could I explain the photo of her in the uniform? The blueprints? My heart broke for her. No wonder she had been so sullen, so reserved all her life. Somewhere out there was a world, her world, suffering the most terrible despotism. It was her grand mission to save it. She was the last hope of her people. And she had failed. Were they still suffering under the yoke, waiting for an interdimensional rescue that would never come? But, she said to me, gripping my wrist tightly, it still could come. Listen to me, I will be dead very soon, but not you. Take the plans, take the box, she pleaded. Please, one day make sure that the machine is built, you have to. Whatever it takes. Billions of women and children across eternity are begging for rescue. Please, don't fail like I did. Freeing a parallel universe from Nazi occupation is a tremendous responsibility to place on a 15-year-old child. But she did it, and, quite sobbing, what could I say? Except, I'll try, grandmother. There was one more thing in the box, another stack of papers, covered in flowery German handwriting. What are these? She sat up sharply in her hospital bed when she saw them. Immediately, she tried to play it down and relaxed again, but I noticed the brief shock. "These are my private writings," she said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Please burn them, and do it quickly. I don't want them to outlive me." "Of course, grandmother." I said goodbye. I hugged her with tears in my eyes. She died 5 days later. I didn't know what to do. She swore me to secrecy until such time as I could reasonably be expected to build this great machine. Again, I was 15 years old. I certainly wouldn't try to rip holes in space and time from my bedroom and take part in debating tournaments on the side. As the weeks went by and her body went into the ground, I became less sure that I believed her. I didn't doubt her, but it was all crazy. Maybe she just went crazy with age. And yet, I must have spent hours studying those blueprints. They never became clearer. All those numbers, square roots, wild calculations could have been the height of genius or absolute nonsense. I couldn't tell. Years passed. I never forgot. But there was little I could do, so I put it aside. Until recently, I am now in my 4th year of university, about to graduate. With all due respect to my grandmother, I did not choose to study physics. I thought about my grandmother's story just a few weeks ago, until a few weeks ago. I was working on a seminar paper that examined the European dictatorships of the 20th century. Of course, Nazi Germany and the Stalinist Soviet Union are first and foremost in the discussion. A whole subsection of the paper, I promise it's relevant, is about dictatorships and euphemisms. For example, when it comes to the Nazis, frightened women and children are rounded up, marched to freshly dug pits, slaughtered by the hundreds and their still twitching corpses buried, all referred to only as a special action. For the Bolsheviks under Stalin, invading Poland or the Baltic states, executing tens of thousands of teachers, officers, priests, writers, and peasants, deporting tens of thousands more to bleak Siberia, introducing totalitarian state machinery and suppressing any form of resistance is liberation. It was the perusal of such morbid sources that my grandmother suddenly and sharply reappeared in my thoughts. I always carried the small box with me without my parents, my siblings, or anyone else knowing about it. And it hit me. I was at university now. I might not be a physicist myself, but there were plenty of brilliant mathematicians on campus. At least a few I knew who had published on multiverse theories. If my grandmother wasn't crazy, if I really had a duty to liberate her homeworld, where better to start building that great machine than here? I went to the closet in my apartment and took out the box I hadn't opened in years. The first thing that caught my eye was her private writings. I was ashamed that I hadn't burned them when she asked, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. A deep-rooted instinct held me back. I wanted to go to a certain physics professor, who I knew considered himself a many-worlder, and try to gently address all this craziness and see where it took me. But my grandmother's private writings kept coming back to me. Finally, I decided to read them. I asked her forgiveness from beyond the grave, but I justified that I needed to know exactly what was going on. Her writings might shed light on things, except I couldn't read them. They were in German and in a flowery handwriting that would have made even English difficult for me. So instead, I took them to a girl I knew. Actually, a friend of a friend. Fluent in German, a foreign language student. She asked me what they were, and realized that they looked old. I told her it was a speculative fiction written from the perspective of a young woman sent from a world almost conquered by the Nazis to ours, in the hope of saving her own universe. She asked if I could write clearly and fluently in German, what did I need her for? I told her I hadn't written it. She asked how I knew what it was about if I hadn't written it. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I asked her to please just tell me what it said. So she began to read. She finished quickly. It was only about 5 pages. She looked up at me again, quite confused, somewhat bored. She thought it was just a story, after all. "Well, it doesn't seem like it's written in a world where Hitler wins," she said. "It looks like it's written in a world where Stalin wins." This took me completely by surprise. I got a sinking feeling in my stomach. I asked her to explain it more clearly. She told me it was a letter written by a general of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, to a subordinate, a comrade Colonel Maria Macer, my grandmother. So, these were not my grandmother's private writings. Rather, they were writings addressed to her. This girl told me that it seemed as though the Soviet Union had somehow established control over the entire planet in the world of history. There were references to Mexican, Yoruba, German, Kurdish, Japanese, and even New English Soviet republics. There wasn't enough information to reveal exactly how this had happened, but somehow humanity was subject to a global Stalinist dictatorship. I still barely understood. Had my grandmother lied to me about the world she came from? Why? My grandmother, a colonel in Stalin's secret police? I begged her to read on, sweat on my hands. She said the letter said nothing about bringing armies from our world to liberate theirs. Rather, it spoke of bringing armies from her world into ours. I remembered the photograph of my grandmother in her uniform. I could imagine the edges of the insignia sewn onto her sleeve, mostly obscured by the camera's angle. And I recognized what it was, a narrowed point and 2 converging lines. It was the edge of a red star surrounding a hammer and sickle. And finally I realized it. I realized that I had been taken for a fool. I realized that there had never been a Nazi-ruled dystopia. I realized why my grandmother wanted me to burn these papers as quickly as possible, why she didn't want me to read them. I realized why she so urgently wanted this great machine to be built, because the letter ended as follows. "Remember, Comrade Macer, the world you are going to is still firmly in the age of capitalist darkness. This is to be the 5th world, alongside our own, which we are forever freeing from the limitations of capitalist production. I cannot overemphasize the importance of the machine being built to the specifications. We sent you through with a prototype. But the machine you have to oversee the construction of in World 38 must be exponentially superior. It must be able to transport from our world at least several hundred fronts of the Red Army, some 500 million men in the armed forces. This is what our analysts estimate to be the minimum necessary for the military defeat of World 38, the liquidation of all class enemies and counter-revolutionaries, estimated at a total of 200 to 300 million, the pacification of all hostile populations, and finally the true and total liberation of this world and its peoples. Good luck, comrade." My grandfather is 95 years old and not long left in this world. There is nothing but a tangle of tubes and wires keeping him here with us. It is hard for him to speak, but each hoarse whisper carries a heavy meaning that cannot be interrupted. My family doesn't talk about things like death, though, so whenever I visit my father, we spend most of our time sitting in near silence. "What a week for the news, right?" my father might say. Grandpa grunts. "Crazy world." Then silence again. Small talk seems almost disrespectful to the gravity of the situation, but no one wants to be the first to broach the irreversible farewell. When the silence gets too loud, my father starts fumbling with his phone or pulling out a book until one of us finds an excuse to leave. Such was the case yesterday when my father mumbled something about a dentist appointment and rushed out the door almost as quickly as we arrived. "You're staying, aren't you?" my grandfather said as we were left alone in the room together. "You're going to hear an old man's last secret." This was it, then. The end of the road was in sight. "Do you want me to call Dad back?" I asked. Grandpa shook his head, as far as the oxygen tubes would allow. I'd rather he not know. I already knew part of the story he was telling me. It started when my grandfather was 20 years old and living in Nazi Germany. He had been doing forced labor on a farm, but managed to smuggle my grandmother and my father, an infant, out of the country, hidden in a shipment of grain. He was caught almost immediately and sent to the Buchenwald concentration camp, where he survived for the next 2 years until he was liberated by Allied forces. "You don't have to tell me what happened there if you don't want to," I said to him. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the gruesome details. However, he was unusually sprightly and insistent, and promised it was something that needed to be said. He would not have survived the horror if he had not met a friend there. One of the Nazi officers, a Rottenführer, had taken a special interest in him because of their striking similarity in age and appearance. Sitting on either side of a barbed wire fence, the two exchanged stories about their childhoods. My grandfather talked about my grandmother, how beautiful she was, and how he would not give up until he found her again. The SS officer had joined the army directly from the Hitler Youth and had never had an intimate relationship with a woman. He was fascinated by my grandfather's tales of romance, and the two became close friends despite the circumstances. The officer twice spared my grandfather's name from labor assignments that meant certain death, and he often slipped extra rations through the fence that my grandfather then distributed to other prisoners. It wasn't a good life, but it was life, and that was good, Grandfather said. Things changed as the war drew to a close. Nazi officers became increasingly paranoid and desperate as Allied forces advanced. It became common practice to hold lower-ranking officers as scapegoats when impossible work orders were not fulfilled. Furthermore, the rumor that the Rottenführer protected my grandfather put him in a hopeless situation with his own officers. Faced with the choice between protecting my grandfather or keeping his own hiding place, the Rottenführer signed the order to send my grandfather to a nearby arms factory. 18-hour workdays, hunger rations, no medical care. The factory was the equivalent of a death sentence. The survival rate after 3 months was less than 50%. In the name of love, my grandfather begged him to let him live so that he could find her again. She was waiting for him in America. The Rottenführer was moved, but his decision was final. His only concession was to write down the address where she had gone and to send her a letter to tell her what had happened to him. "So, how did you manage to survive?" I asked. "Did he change his mind? Were you rescued from the factory?" Protected from the worst of the camp by the Rottenführer, the transition to the factory proved too difficult for the young farmer. He didn't survive the first week. "What do you mean, didn't survive the first week? How did you get out?" The strain of the long story took its toll on my grandfather. He coughed and gasped, struggling for breath for several seconds before clearing his throat for good. On April 11th, 1945, the Buchenwald camp was liberated. Many of the Nazis had already abandoned their positions and fled into the countryside. Others chose to seal themselves in and pretend to be prisoners themselves in order to gain the favor of the Allied forces. This was especially convincing for those who had taken the time to get to know the prisoners and could assume their identities. When the SS officer gave the information and the address of his lost love, he was allowed to board the next transport ship to America to be reunited with her. The gears in my head turned, and then they stopped. Your grandmother was suspicious at first when I met her, but she accepted that the war had changed me. Besides, I knew so many stories about her that she couldn't deny our shared history. I raised his son like my own and lived the life he dreamed of every night until he died. Do you think your real grandfather would forgive me if he knew? I didn't have an answer for him then, and I didn't get a second chance. He died peacefully in his sleep that night after a long and happy life that wasn't his. At that time, it was early winter of 1943, and my grandfather's company was stationed in a remote village of about 500 people. Part of the advantage of this location was that it was really hard to reach, and therefore had little chance of being attacked spontaneously by Nazi Germany. However, this was also a disadvantage because communication with the rest of the Swiss military was very difficult. The communication problem was further exacerbated when a series of snowstorms hit the region in early December, completely destroying the few communication lines they had at all. They were basically trapped in this isolated Swiss village, unable to contact the rest of the army. My grandfather's captain decided that it was best to maintain the existing orders and continue to defend the village. Weeks passed. All roads to the outside world were buried under 2 to 3 meters of heavy snowfall, and all telegraph and telephone lines were equally useless. The winter deepened. The leaves were swept from the trees, and the bare trunks stuck out like broken ribs from the mountainside. The town was nestled between 2 large mountains. Sunlight reached the town directly only a few hours a day, making the soldiers feel as if they were living in a state of eternal twilight. One night, my grandfather was in the village pub with a few of his comrades when a group of locals approached them. One of them was particularly visibly annoyed. All the Swiss in the village grew up speaking German and were not used to having British people around them. So one of them began shouting in broken English, "Where are you taking the children?" Fortunately, one of the men my grandfather was drinking with spoke fluent German and was able to serve as an improvised translator. After several minutes of confusion and shouting, the translator turned to my grandfather and the rest of the soldiers and said, "They say some of the village children have disappeared. They want us to do something about it." Obviously, the British military is not simply behaving like a bunch of mercenaries for hire, so my grandfather and his friends asked the villagers to return to headquarters, actually just a makeshift barrack set up in the village church, to talk to the captain. Due to the language barrier, the villagers' discussion with the captain lasted about 2 hours. Basically, the captain and his self-appointed translator could only find out that, a few weeks after the company entered the village, the locals noticed a series of bizarre incidents. At first, it was just harmless things like pieces of wood and tarps disappearing from people's sheds. But over the next 2 months, people started discovering valuable items stolen from their homes. One man claimed that his family heirloom, a handcrafted ceremonial halberd, a type of traditional Swiss war hoe, had gone missing from above his mantelpiece. The culmination of all these incidents was when a village child went missing. Naturally, many assumed that the child's disappearance, though tragic and disturbing, was due to something simple like the boy falling into a snowdrift while playing outside, or possibly being attacked and killed by a wolf or other predator. But it wasn't just one child who had gone missing. It was several. The villager who had come to the pub especially annoyed. That was the father of 2 young boys who had disappeared 2 days earlier. He had searched everywhere for them and had even enlisted a group of his fellow villagers to help. But they had been unable to find a single clue as to what had happened to the children. The captain told the villagers that he would look into the matter further, and that he would begin to have some of his men patrol the streets each night to find whoever, or whatever, was behind all the strange thefts and abductions. Later that night, Private Reginald disappeared from the barracks. Disappearing children was one thing, but a grown man. It seemed unlikely that an animal, even a wolf, could overpower a healthy, fully grown man on its own. Of course, rumors began to spread that there was some kind of monster in the mountains that came down at night to feast on the villagers. Despite the nightly patrols that the captain had ordered, the disappearances continued to occur. Reginald was the only adult victim of what was haunting the village. The rest of the victims were all young children between the ages of 5 and 10. In total, including the original 3 missing children, 7 children disappeared from the town. Many people at my grandfather's company became suspicious. One rumor that had spread was that impoverished villagers were actually selling their own children to traffickers for extra money. But even that didn't make sense because the roads in and out of the village were still blocked by snow. 3 more weeks passed without incident, by which time it was early spring and the snow was starting to thaw. That night, coincidentally, when my grandfather was on patrol with several other soldiers, they uncovered what was behind the disappearance of the children and Reginald. It was sometime past midnight when my grandfather and his comrades noticed a figure peering through the bedroom window of one of the villagers' houses. My grandfather was at the far end of the street, so the figure looking through the window did not see the patrol at first. My grandfather and the other soldiers called out to the intruder, and he immediately jumped out the window and started running. Everyone in the patrol was sure that this was the one behind the disappearances and burglaries. They ran after it as fast as they could, through the melting snow and ice in the dead of night, shouting for whatever it was to stop. They ran further and further and soon found themselves at the edge of the village, where the snow was still quite deep. The figure jumped into the ground. At first it looked as if it had vanished into thin air, but as the patrol approached, they realized that the intruder had actually simply jumped into a cave that had been carved into the side of a snowdrift. Just as the soldiers began shouting into the cave for the figure to come out and show himself, several shots exploded from the entrance of the snow cave. Without thinking, my grandfather and the rest of the patrol shouldered their weapons and all began firing into the hole. They waited what seemed like hours, but was really only a few minutes. One incredibly brave member of the patrol volunteered to climb into the cave and take a look. He drew his pistol, knelt down, and crawled into the cave. A few seconds later, he emerged with a look of utter horror on his face. My grandfather took out his flashlight and shined it into the cave when he saw the gruesome explanation behind the strange happenings in the village. The shape they had chased was Reginald, the private who had gone missing weeks ago. They had shot Reginald right through the heart. The cave was not only occupied by Reginald, but also by the bodies of 7 partially eaten children. Either due to the stress of being snowed in all winter, living in almost constant darkness, or some kind of terrible mental disorder, Reginald had completely lost his mind and started breaking into villagers' homes and kidnapping their children in the middle of the night. He had used the halberd, which had been reported missing, to dismember the bodies after slitting the children's throats and hid them in the cave he had carved into the snowdrift. After I finished my military service, I couldn't find a job to support my family, so I formed a mercenary group with a few friends. They were ex-soldiers just like me. Our first jobs weren't difficult. We worked for people who needed protection. It was easy money for us. After a few such jobs, we started traveling to war zones where we fought on the side that paid better. After a few missions, we lost some good men, our friends, our brothers. After we lost 10 men in Syria, our group disbanded because it was no longer worth losing friends over money. After we broke up, we all tried to find normal jobs, but it was hard to find work for all of us, because the only thing we knew was violence. That day, I received an email offering us a good amount of money for a job that I thought was easy, and I thought the money offered was worth it. Our job was to protect a scientist so that he could safely explore an abandoned Nazi bunker. I seriously thought about taking on this job, getting the money, and never having to work again. I called my buddies from my former group. There were only 6 of us left. I pitched them the offer I got, and they all agreed to take the job because it was an easy assignment. About my group, or what's left of it, there's Tom, Vlad, Bob, Jacob, Sam and me, Martin, Vlad was my second in command because he was the most experienced after me. He was more skeptical about this job because it seemed too good to be true. So much money for a seemingly easy job. After we decided to take the job, I contacted the people who had sent me the email and told them we would take the job. They told us to come to a town in Poland called Redacted. Once we were there, we would meet the scientist and go to the bunker with him. They told us that we would receive reinforcements after a few hours. This last part made me think that exploring the bunker would not be so safe. I asked them why we would need reinforcements, and they just said it was for security reasons. In the morning, we boarded the plane and landed in Redacted in Poland. We met the scientist. His name was Antony. After meeting him, we were taken by truck to the bunker target, which was located deep in the forest. When we arrived at the forest, we drove for a few hours to a clearing in the middle of the forest. In the middle of the clearing, there were a few sandbags around what appeared to be the entrance to the bunker. The door to the bunker was sealed. We couldn't open the door, so we used explosives to break the door open. After we opened the door, Bob, Jacob, and Sam stayed on the surface to guard the place, while Tom, Vlad, and Tony and I entered the bunker. As we went down the stairs of the bunker, we entered a small hallway that was full of dust. We then entered a door at the end of the hallway. After passing through the door, we found a series of rooms. The first room we entered was a kind of barracks with bunk beds, a suitcase, and a Nazi flag nailed to the wall. In the next room, we found a radio station that, surprisingly, was still working, although all you could hear was static. In the next room, we found what looked like an officer's office. It had a nice bed, a chair, and a table with a lamp on it. On the table were some documents that were in German. We collected the documents so that we could read them later. After entering another barracks, we found a cross attached to a lamp in the room, spinning as if someone had just turned it. We wondered how it could turn, but our thoughts were interrupted by Antony's cries. We rushed to him and found him pointing to the corner of the room. We looked in the corner, and it was full of human corpses. We calmed Antony and approached the corpses to examine them. I almost screamed when a hand emerged from the pile of corpses. We pulled the person out of the pile. His skin was white like a ghost, and his facial expression was empty. We tried to make him speak, but he remained silent. We didn't know how he had managed to get into the bunker when it was sealed. After another attempt to make him speak failed, we decided to lock him up in one of the barracks. I went outside to check on the guys on the surface. As I left the bunker, Bob pulled me to the ground and pointed into the woods. There was a light glowing in the woods. Bob said that the light could have come from a sniper rifle. So we decided to fire at their position. After a few minutes of firing, we sent Sam to check the position for a body. He went to check the position, and when he returned, he said that there was no one there, and no blood indicated that someone had been there. Although we found no one and did not know what had caused the light, we were on high alert. We decided to put someone on guard duty for the night. Jacob and Tom volunteered to be the first guards, while the rest of us went to sleep in the bunker. After we settled into the barracks, we went to sleep. We were awakened in the middle of the night by Nazi music playing at the radio station. We tried to turn off the radio, but the music wouldn't stop. So Vlad got angry and destroyed the radio station, and finally the music stopped. We tried to find out who had played the music, but everyone in our group said it wasn't them. Then I remembered the man we had found in the shelter. Maybe it was he who had played the music. We went to the room where we had locked him, and he was still there, staring at the wall. We decided to leave him alone. Since we had all been awakened, we went to Jacob and Tom to see if they were all right. When we came to the surface, we saw that the two were smoking cigarettes. We stayed to talk to them, while Antony decided to go back to sleep. Outside, there was a fog over the forest, as if it were veiling it. It was peaceful outside. Until I saw some people standing in the forest. They didn't try to hide, but just stood there watching us. We immediately took cover. We thought they were going to attack us, so we decided to shoot at them. We fired at them, but they just stood there, motionless as statues, while bullets went through their bodies. And after a while, they just disappeared into the fog, just as they had come. We were now certain that there were people near the bunker. I ordered everyone to keep watch while I checked on Antoni. I found him in the hallway, looking at something. As I approached, I saw that he was looking at a map. It was a map of the bunker. I asked him why he was looking at the map, and he murmured that something was wrong with the map because it said that there was another room in the bunker. A large room, larger than all the other rooms. When I looked at the map more closely, it did indeed show that there should be a large room in the bunker, but somehow we hadn't come across it. When I looked at it more closely, I saw that the room was connected to the officer's office. The two of us went to the officer's office and started looking for the entrance to the room. We searched for a long time until I accidentally pushed the bed. Underneath, I found a hatch. I opened the hatch and found a staircase. Antoni and I went down the stairs and entered the room. In the room, there was a camera and something that looked like a machine. I had never seen such a machine before. While Antoni looked excited like a child, he took pictures of the machine and wrote something in his book. I asked him what the machine was, but he said he didn't know. I left him alone in the room and went to the guys. Some of the guys went back to the barracks to sleep while Tom and Jacob kept watch. I sent a message to our employers to let them know that we had managed to enter the bunker, but I didn't get a reply from them. I was tired and went to sleep. In the morning, I was the first to wake up, and I went to check on Tom and Jacob. When I left the bunker, I found them both. Their hands were tied together, their necks had been cut, and there was a bullet casing in Tom's eye. They had been dead for a few hours. I pulled out the bullet casing. It was a 7.92 by 57 Mauser. This bullet was used by the Germans in the Second World War. After I had informed everyone of what had happened, we buried our friends. Vlad was most affected by the death of our friends. He hit me and said that it was my fault that our friends were dead. That hurt me because I would never have taken on this job if I had known it was going to be dangerous. We saw the people in the forest again, just like last time. We shot at them, but they disappeared again. I sent an email to our client saying that we had suffered losses. This time, I received a reply. They told me that we would receive reinforcements after 72 hours. I went to see Antoni because I suspected that he knew more than he had told us when we met. I looked for him in the bunker and found him in the large room with the machine. He was repairing the camera and trying to play a tape he had found. I asked him to tell me everything he knew about this mission. He hesitated at first, but finally he told me that he knew this assignment was dangerous, and that we were not the first to attempt this assignment, and that everyone who had tried had died. He said his job was to find this machine and find out its purpose, and he said that he might have found out, he just needed to fix the camera. After he fixed the camera, he put the tape in and activated the camera. In the video, we saw the Nazis conducting experiments. They put a soldier in the machine, and after he came out, they shot him in the head. But after a few seconds, he got up again as if nothing had happened, and his behavior was almost like that of a robot. He showed no emotion, just stood still and followed the orders he was given. Antoni then told me that he had read in the documents that the Nazis were conducting experiments to find a way to create super soldiers. But they had stopped in 1943 due to a lack of funding. As the video continued, we saw a familiar figure, the man we had found in the video. He was the officer who led the experiments. I went to see the man, but found his room empty, and Sam, who was supposed to be guarding him, had disappeared. I asked Vlad if he had seen the two of them leave the bunker, but he said he had been on guard duty and no one had left the bunker. We searched the bunker, but found only the man in the officer's office, and he smiled at us. On the table was Sam's head. I was furious and shot him in the head. He fell to the floor. I looked at him lying on the floor. Then, suddenly the lights went out, just for a second, but the man's body disappeared. We went to the surface to find Vlad and Bob. They looked into the forest and again we saw the figures in the forest. This time, however, they were moving slowly towards us. We opened fire on them and even threw grenades at them, but it didn't stop their advance. As they closed in, we were forced to retreat back to the bunker. But as we retreated, Bob was too slow, and they caught up with him. We heard his screams, but we had to keep retreating. We locked the door to the hallway, but that wouldn't stop them for long. We were trapped. We went into the big room. Vlad was beside himself with rage. He said it was all my fault, that I had suggested the mission and that I was responsible for the death of our friends. I had enough of him shouting at me and said that it was also his fault because he had also agreed to take on the mission. And Tony told us to stop fighting and to find a way out of the bunker. We stopped fighting to look for a way out. I looked at the map of the bunker and didn't see any secret exits, but I did notice that the ventilation shafts led outside. So I saw the ventilation shafts in the corner. The only problem was that they were too high. I climbed on Vlad's shoulders and managed to get into the ventilation shaft. We heard the door being destroyed, so we knew they had entered. We didn't have much time to lose. I woke Antoni up and tried to lift Vlad, but he was too heavy. I saw that things were starting to enter the room, and I saw them clearly for the first time. They were Nazi soldiers. When I couldn't lift Vlad for the 10th time, he decided to hold them back while we escape. He started shooting at them with his machine gun, but it only slowed them down a bit. After a few minutes, he stopped shooting, and I assumed he had been killed. We started to go through the ventilation shaft. It was dark inside, but I started to see a light at the end of the shaft. I heard Antoni scream that something had caught his leg and was pulling him back. I tried to help him, but whatever was pulling him was stronger and dragged him away into the darkness. I continued walking and came out of the ventilation shaft. At that moment, I was surrounded by Nazi soldiers. I thought that this was the end, that I would die. But then the officer stood before me and said that he could deploy more soldiers. After he said that, I lost consciousness. After what seemed like hours, I woke up. I stood still, unable to move my body. I was standing in the forest with other Nazi soldiers. I also saw Vlad, dressed in a Nazi uniform. The officer congratulated me on joining and said I would be a good soldier. I couldn't say anything, but stared in horror. After exactly 72 hours, I saw a group of soldiers, followed by a female scientist, enter the bunker. The officer started smiling. I have experienced strange things in the area where I live. So, I started collecting information about the paranormal to understand what is going on. You see, I live in an old building originally built for 14 students. But after some research, I realized that I live in an old Nazi-haunted building where strange things happen to residents. To give you a better idea of what kind of building it is, I will first tell you the dark history of this place. In 1940, during the Second World War, the Germans bombed Rotterdam to the ground. Almost all buildings were destroyed, including the building that used to stand on this site. Then, in 1941, they rebuilt this large place under Nazi command. Not much is known about the use of this place during the war, only that many people went in and only a few came out. When the war was almost won and the Allies came to retake Rotterdam, The sky was black with smoke rising from this place. A large fire in the courtyard destroyed all evidence. When the war ended, the terrible things that happened in this building also stopped. The authorities could not determine what had really happened here. Only a few documents were found that named 6 SS soldiers and 1 Nazi scientist. The Allies used this important information to find these men and bring them to trial for crimes against humanity. The men they were looking for were eventually found in different parts of the world. Some moved to Austria, 3 to Argentina, and 1 even moved to Hong Kong. The strange thing was that all the Nazi men had hanged themselves, covering their eyes. It was a kind of suicide pact that makes you wonder why they moved to another country at all. The building itself was supposed to be destroyed, but because Rotterdam was bombed and many people were homeless, they left this building standing so that people could live in it. The only problem was that no one wanted to live in this place. People claimed that it was haunted by the atrocities committed there. You could hear screams and crying, but when you looked for the source, you couldn't find anything. Finally, a foreigner whose past is unknown bought the building and turned it into a newspaper company. When he heard the stories about the hauntings, he simply ignored them. He never heard the screams or the crying and thought they were spooky bedtime stories. Later, he remembered that buying this place was the worst decision of his life. At the time, it was an ideal location for a newspaper company. The first floor was large enough to accommodate a variety of journalists and editors. On the ground floor, there was a large room where the newspapers could be printed and stacked. The basement itself was large and pitch black. The darkness made it an ideal place to develop photos in the red light. The only real light that could illuminate the place came from the lamps hanging from the ceiling, but these almost never worked. The photo team always had to carry a flashlight with them, but even these devices often failed. At first, the newspaper was a huge success. Many people loved the stories that were written. Most of the stories were about innovations that made life easier. After a while, however, the stories became less and less positive and more gloomy. Eventually, all the stories revolved around the ways in which new technologies could kill you in seconds. It was disturbing how often the word kill was used in an article. Naturally, this was not very popular with the people, and they demanded an explanation. Apparently, all the journalists and editors working at the newspaper were suffering from some kind of depression. It got so bad that many journalists committed suicide. The others went crazy and had to be taken to an institution that could help them. The people who worked with the printers on the ground floor didn't have a dream job either. There were far too many accidents. A perfectly functioning printer suddenly stopped working. Then the poor guy who had to fix it suddenly realized that the printer started working again while his hand was still in the device. Many workers lost their hands or legs because some strange things happened. But that wasn't the worst injury. A strange disease had taken hold of the men working there. The disease forced the workers to drink ink, gallons of ink. The ink damaged every organ in their bodies until they died in a horrible way. Not much is known about the people who worked in the basement. Only that they were the first to complain about strange things happening there. It started mildly. A few pictures disappeared. Someone's glasses were found in a different place, and so on. Then it got worse. They started seeing faces and hearing strange noises in the darkness. Finally, they protested against going down, but were forced to do so by the manager. This only stopped until a few workers disappeared down there. The other people quit their jobs and never returned to the building. The owner didn't want all this to become public, so he did his best to keep the secrets hidden. After a while, the accidents and strange things became too great, and the once successful newspaper company was closed. The owner was later found hanged, with his eyes covered. Nobody wanted to buy the building, so it was auctioned off. A man who bought all kinds of different buildings acquired this place at a bargain price. He wanted to set up another business in it, but after visiting the building once, he did nothing more with it. Eventually, the man died, and his cousin, an old hag, inherited the place. She decided to turn the first floor into student rooms and rent them out at a low price. The old hag didn't want to put much effort into the place, so she hired my neighbor to take care of it. He received a small wage and was able to store his valuable vintage cars on the ground floor. My neighbor did this job for a while, often coming into the building and admiring his vintage cars. He spent so much time with these cars that he neglected the building and also his marriage. That changed one day when he spent a little too long admiring his cars. No one knows exactly what happened that night, but he was never the same man again. The people on the first floor told me that they heard strange noises coming from the ground floor that night. Later, they saw my neighbor running for his life as if a lion were chasing him. After that night's events, he sold his classic cars and never spent much time near the building again. He never stayed in the building for more than an hour. Even when he showed me my room, he seemed very strange and unusual. He even told me that I should choose a better option if there was one. But I had no choice. My father threatened to throw me out of the house, and I needed a room to live in. I took the room, but after 3 years of living in it, I was desperate to find a better place. Now I live in room 3 of the 14 rooms available. It's a small room, but habitable. I was never in my room much. It scared me, especially because of my neighbor, who is mentally ill. She stayed up all night doing the craziest things you can imagine. At one point, she went so crazy that she hit her head against the shower and screamed and shouted that the voices must have come out. That was finally the moment when she was admitted to an institution. But after 6 months, they sent her back and gave her a cocktail of strong sedatives. She still behaves very strangely, but she is calmer and no longer hits her head. Nevertheless, I felt uncomfortable in this place. So I spent most of my time with my parents or my girlfriend. I was here no more than twice a week, but Corona changed all that. Now I'm stuck here. And because I'm here 24/7 now, I understand why this place is called haunted. The first week of my Corona stay here already started strangely. A roommate from room 13 was going through the mail on the mail table in the middle of the hallway. Suddenly, he saw a flash of light coming from the elevator behind the mail table. The elevator was built when the building was a newspaper company. Over time, the elevator broke and they removed it, leaving only the unused elevator shaft. However, there was a small round window through which you could see into the darkness of the elevator shaft. It was too dark to see anything, but nevertheless my roommate tried to find out where this flash of light came from. Then he took out his cell phone and used the flashlight to see better. I have to say, I have never heard such a frightened scream in my life. I immediately ran out of my room to see what had happened, as did many of my roommates. At first, I saw nothing, but upon closer inspection I saw my roommate crawling in the fetal position under the mail table, crying. His face was as pale as a snowman, and his phone was broken on the cold floor. He screamed that a face was looking at him. It was obvious that he was panicking. When he calmed down, he told us to look through the elevator glass. I took my phone and looked over. At first, I didn't see anything and thought he was overreacting. I almost stopped looking until I saw some red paint dripping down the elevator shaft. Then I looked clearly, and 2 red handprints going down the elevator shaft lit up when I pointed my light at them, like they came right out of a horror movie. He told us that he saw the black ink hands moving down those handprints, and when he pointed the light down, he saw a deformed face moving so fast up the elevator shaft that he dropped his cell phone. When my roommate got up, you could see a big wet spot on his pants. That night, he packed his things and went home to his parents. He still has not returned. The police finally came to analyze the blood. When they opened the elevator shaft, a terrible smell filled the building. It wasn't long before they found the remains of what looked like a human being. A whole search party came to find out why a body was found in the elevator. After a week, the police found nothing suspicious in the building. They just said that we should keep the door in the basement locked for some reason. The human remains apparently came from one of the photo developers from the newspaper company's time. The autopsy revealed that the person had died of severe trauma. The person who performed the autopsy stated that he had never seen anything so horrible in his life, and that he had worked there for 30 years. I thought the police officer who told us this was making a sick joke, but he was serious. The weeks following the elevator incident were even more disturbing. One day, black liquid leaked out of every shower. A girl who lived in the building was soaked in this horrible substance and developed a terrible rash. Then, a few days later, a large hole appeared in the ceiling because too many dead rats had strangely accumulated there, and the ceiling could no longer hold the weight. Finally, one of the other girls who lived in the building committed suicide. She was discovered by her best friend. Unfortunately, I walked past the open door when they removed the body. I still can't get that horrible image out of my head. She had her eyes covered, like all the other suicides. I really wanted to leave that place. Summer was almost upon us, and I had already arranged to take care of my sister's house and dog. But before I could leave, the plumbing broke. I called my old neighbor, and he sent some plumbers to help fix it. Apparently, the mentally ill woman next to me had washed all her hair down the sink. The clog was so bad that they had to open the pipes below the first floor. The plumbers didn't like the place and asked me if I wanted to stay nearby. It was the first time I'd stayed on the ground floor. The place looked very old and neglected. While they were busy cleaning the pipes, I looked around and was drawn to a door. It was in the middle of the building. For some reason, I opened the door and stared into the darkness. A strange fear came over me. I just couldn't move, and I stared into the abyss. As my eyes became more accustomed to the darkness, I saw clearly something large moving up the stairs. Every second it came closer and closer, but it made no sound. I remember that I just couldn't move while the thing approached. It looked so real. But when one of the plumbers touched my shoulder, I came out of this strange illusion. I looked down the stairs and saw nothing. I closed the door and left this terrible place. The plumbing was repaired, and the plumbers left quickly. From that point on, I had had enough of this place and happily moved into my sister's house. Unfortunately, this experience was not much better either. Now, I'm back in my room, sitting around idly, waiting for the next strange event to occur. The owner no longer allows new tenants. More and more people are leaving this place. I hope that one day I will be able to leave this place too, because I know that if I stay here too long, I will certainly not survive this place.